My son-in-law left his phone on my couch after a very tense family dinner. When the screen lit up, my heart almost stopped. It was a photo of my wife who had passed away 5 years ago, and the text message below it read, "The 2 million initial payment cleared." The old man is still clueless. My name is Howard. I am 70 years old, and for the last 5 years I thought I was just a grieving widower living a quiet life. I was wrong. I was actually the target of a multi-million-dollar conspiracy orchestrated by the very people I invited to my dinner table. Before I reveal how I dismantled their perfect little lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed always leaves a trail. The dinner that evening had been an absolute nightmare. My daughter Morgan and her husband Bradley sat across from me, their plates of roast beef barely touched. Morgan spent the entire meal complaining about the neighborhood, complaining about the rising cost of living, and casting pitying glances at my worn-out cardigan. Bradley, with his slicked-back blonde hair and expensive designer cologne, just nodded along. He constantly checked his gold watch as if my very presence was a burden on his highly valuable time. They treated me like I was a relic, a fragile old man who was slowly losing his grip on reality. I played along. I nodded. I smiled, and I cleared their plates without a single word of protest. When they finally announced they had a sudden urgent meeting to attend, the silence they left behind in my house was actually a profound relief. I began wiping down the coffee table when I saw it. Bradley had left his cell phone wedged deep between the sofa cushions. I reached out to grab it, intending to rush to the door and call out to him before he backed out of the driveway. But before my fingers could even touch the sleek metal case, the screen lit up. The room was dimly lit, and that sudden burst of bright light caught my eye immediately. I froze. Staring back at me from the locked screen was a photograph of Evelyn. My beautiful, fierce Evelyn, smiling that bright, confident smile she had before the cancer took her from me 5 years ago. My chest tightened with an unbearable ache. Why would Bradley have a picture of my late wife as a contact photo? We rarely even spoke about her anymore. He had only met her a handful of times before she passed away. But it was the caller ID flashing across the top of the screen that sent a cold, sharp chill down my spine. It did not say Evelyn. It did not say Mom. It read Evelyn's Historic Trust. Evelyn's Historic Trust. I repeated the words in my head, my mind absolutely refusing to process the letters. My wife and I had been married for 40 incredible years. We were partners in everything we did. Evelyn came from a long line of hardworking folks in Chicago, but she always maintained she was just as working class as I was. When the doctors told us she had only 6 months left, we spent our quiet evenings going through our finances. We paid off the mortgage on this house. We settled our modest debts. She looked me in the eye, holding my hand with her fragile fingers, and told me she was leaving me nothing but a lifetime of wonderful memories and a paid-off roof over my head. There was never a trust. There was never any hidden fortune or secret commercial property. I was a retired forensic auditor. I spent my entire career tracking hidden assets, uncovering corporate embezzlement, and untangling complex financial webs for massive corporate clients. I knew our accounts inside and out. I handled every tax return, every bank statement, every utility bill for 4 decades, or at least I truly thought I did. My hands began to tremble, not from old age, but from a sudden, overwhelming surge of adrenaline. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes locking onto the preview of the text message that had just pushed through. The words were burned into my memory in an instant. The 2 million initial payment cleared. The old man is still clueless about the lot. The paperwork is ready for the next phase. Make sure he signs the medical forms by Friday. $2 million. A lot. Medical forms. The pieces of a massive, terrifying puzzle began to fall into place with sickening speed. For the past month, Morgan had been relentlessly bringing up my health. She kept insisting I was becoming forgetful, misplacing my keys, repeating stories from my youth. Bradley had even brought over a lawyer friend to casually discuss medical power of attorney, claiming it was just a standard precaution for someone my age. They were not worried about my declining health. They were actively trying to declare me incompetent. They were trying to take legal control of me because of whatever this historic trust was. My own daughter and the man she married were orchestrating a massive financial fraud right under my nose, using the memory of my dead wife to do it. The betrayal hit me so hard I had to grab the edge of the sofa to steady my shaking legs. The pain in my chest was sharp and agonizing, but the grief was quickly swallowed by something much colder and much more dangerous. Suddenly, a harsh white light swept across the living room walls. Headlights. The loud crunch of tires on my gravel driveway broke the silence. Bradley was coming back for his phone. I had maybe 10 seconds to make a decision that would alter the rest of my life. The old Howard, the grieving father who just wanted his family to be united, would have grabbed the phone, marched out to the driveway, and demanded answers. He would have screamed and cried and begged his daughter to explain why she was doing this to her own flesh and blood. But that man died the exact second I read that text message. The man standing in the living room now was the forensic auditor. The man who knew that if you confront a rat before you close all the traps, the rat simply scurries back into the walls and destroys the evidence. I needed absolute proof. I needed the full picture of this conspiracy. And to get that, I needed them to believe I was exactly what they thought. I was a clueless, fragile, senile old fool. I heard the heavy thud of car doors slamming shut. Heavy footsteps hurried up the front porch steps. The key turned aggressively in the lock. I dropped the phone back onto the sofa cushion exactly where it had been resting. I quickly grabbed my polishing cloth and knelt by the coffee table, vigorously wiping a spot that was already perfectly clean. The front door burst open. Bradley stood in the doorway, breathless, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He looked absolutely terrified. It was the look of a desperate man who realized he had just left a loaded weapon in the hands of his victim. His eyes locked onto the sofa, and I saw his shoulders drop in a massive sigh of relief when he saw the phone still wedged in the cushions, the screen completely dark. I slowly looked up at him, letting my mouth hang open slightly, narrowing my eyes as if I was struggling to recognize him in the dim light. "Oh, Bradley," I said, my voice intentionally wavering, carrying a slight confused tremor. "Did you forget your jacket? Morgan said it was going to be chilly tonight." Bradley stared at me intensely, searching my face for any sign of suspicion or anger. He found nothing but the empty, harmless gaze of an old man losing his mind. "No, Howard," he replied, a smug, arrogant smirk slowly creeping back onto his face. "I just forgot my phone. You know how it is. My memory is slipping." I smiled warmly, leaning heavily on the table as I stood up, playing the part to perfection. "We all get a little forgetful sometimes, son. Have a safe drive." He grabbed his phone, turned his back on me, and walked out the door, completely unaware that he had just declared war on the wrong old man. The heavy oak door clicked shut, and the deadbolt slid into place with a resounding, heavy thud. I stood alone in the center of my living room, listening to the aggressive roar of Bradley's engine fading into the distance down the quiet suburban street. The moment the sound vanished, my knees finally buckled. I sank heavily onto the sofa, gripping the worn fabric of the armrest until my knuckles turned completely white. The performance I had just delivered cost me every ounce of my emotional energy, but I had survived the initial breach without giving myself away. I closed my eyes and took a deep, stabilizing breath. The image of Evelyn on that phone screen burned brightly and painfully in my mind. For 5 long years, I had honored her memory by living a quiet, unassuming life. I tended to her rose garden in the backyard. I kept her favorite classic novels dusted on the shelves. I believed our chapter of ambition and struggle was beautifully closed. Now I realized her name was being dragged through the dirt by a parasite who had married into my family. I did not sleep a single second that night. I could not. I paced through the dark corridors of my home, my mind operating at a terrifying, calculated speed. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to mock my previous ignorance. I had invited my daughter and her husband into this sanctuary week after week. I had cooked for them. I had listened to their endless complaints about modern life. All the while they were systematically plotting my financial execution and betting on my demise. By the time the first rays of gray morning light crept through the kitchen blinds, the grieving, vulnerable father was completely gone. The forensic auditor had taken total, absolute control. I needed a clear, unvarnished picture of the battlefield. I needed to know exactly how deep their surveillance went and what other traps they had laid inside my own walls. I walked into my study and locked the solid wooden door behind me. I opened the bottom drawer of my heavy mahogany desk, feeling for the false bottom I had built years ago. I pulled out a reinforced steel lockbox. Inside sat my old work laptop. It was not connected to the standard internet provider. It was a heavily encrypted machine I used during my days investigating offshore shell companies, tracking money laundering syndicates, and exposing corporate embezzlement. I plugged it into a secure power source and booted it up. The familiar loud hum of the cooling fan felt like the warm greeting of an old, trusted friend returning from a long journey. I bypassed the standard login screens and launched a highly specialized network scanning software. If Bradley was bold enough to leave his smartphone on my couch, he was arrogant enough to leave other digital footprints scattered around my property. I initiated a deep packet inspection of my home network. I watched the command lines scroll rapidly across the black screen, a cascade of green text revealing the hidden truth. I knew every single device authorized to be on this network. I knew the specific address of my television, my tablet, my desktop computer, and my smart thermostat. But within 3 tense minutes, the diagnostic software flagged 2 glaring anomalies. 2 unrecognized addresses were actively piggybacking on my router. They were not just connected, they were transmitting a steady, continuous stream of encrypted data outward. They were uploading live, high-definition video to an external cloud server. The cold reality of the situation washed over me like ice water. I was being actively watched in my own home. I grabbed a sophisticated electronic bug sweeper from my old field kit. I calibrated the frequency to match the rogue signals and slowly, methodically moved through the house. The device remained silent in the kitchen and the guest hallway. But the moment I stepped back into the living room, the digital meter spiked wildly. I followed the invisible signal to the large bookshelf near the television. Hidden perfectly inside the hollowed-out eye of a decorative wooden owl Evelyn had bought during a vacation in Mexico was a micro camera. The lens was the precise size of a pinhead. Its angle captured the entire seating area and the front door perfectly. I backed away slowly, keeping my face devoid of any shock or emotion. I walked back into my study. The sweeper spiked a second time. This time, the signal led me directly to the smoke detector mounted on the ceiling directly above my desk. Bradley had installed it himself 2 weeks ago, claiming the old one was faulty and insisting he wanted to ensure my safety from fire hazards. It was a masterpiece of sociopathic manipulation. He had secured a front-row seat to my private life, monitoring my physical state and attempting to capture views of my financial documents. My initial instinct was primal, violent, and destructive. I desperately wanted to grab a heavy steel hammer, smash the wooden owl to splinters, tear the smoke detector from the ceiling, and mail the broken pieces directly to my son-in-law. I wanted to show him that Howard the auditor was wide awake and ready for war. But doing so would immediately expose my hand and ruin my strategic advantage. If I destroyed those cameras, Bradley would instantly panic. He would realize his cover was blown. He would accelerate his timeline, finalize the fraudulent medical forms, and file for emergency guardianship before I could secure my assets and build a legally bulletproof case. I needed to feed his massive ego. I needed him to believe his surveillance operation was working flawlessly. The cameras were not a threat anymore. They were my personal stage. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a cup of scalding hot black coffee. I filled the mug dangerously close to the brim, ensuring the liquid reached the very edge. I shuffled back into the living room, making sure my posture was unnaturally hunched and my steps were agonizingly slow and uneven. I positioned myself squarely in the center of the wooden owl's field of view. I stared blankly at the blank television screen for a long, uncomfortable moment, letting my jaw hang slightly open in an expression of vacant confusion. I forced my right hand to develop a severe, violent tremor. The hot coffee sloshed over the rim, burning my skin, but I did not flinch or break character. I let the tremor escalate, intentionally losing control of my motor functions until the ceramic mug slipped from my fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, deafening crash, shattering into dozens of sharp, white, jagged pieces. Dark coffee splattered across the polished floorboards, staining the rug. I slowly dropped to my knees, letting out a loud, pathetic groan of frustration and despair. I patted the floor blindly, sweeping my bare hands through the spilled liquid and the sharp ceramic shards as if I had completely lost my bearings. I whispered my dead wife's name over and over, sounding absolutely heartbroken, hopelessly lost, and entirely disconnected from reality. I crawled around the mess, pretending to wipe the floor with my cardigan sleeve, painting a picture of total cognitive collapse. I knew Bradley was watching the live feed. I knew somewhere in his polished downtown office he was sitting back in his expensive leather chair, smiling at the computer screen, completely convinced that my mind was finally breaking beyond repair. Let him smile. Let him compile his fake medical reports. Let him underestimate the fragile old man crying on the living room floor. He thought he was directing a tragic documentary about an aging father. He did not realize I was already drafting his federal indictment. I spent the next hour cleaning up the shattered ceramic and cold coffee, moving with the agonizing slowness of a frail invalid. Once the mess was completely cleared away, I retreated to the hallway bathroom, a verified blind spot outside Bradley's hidden surveillance net. I washed my face, splashed freezing water over my tired eyes, and immediately straightened my hunched posture. I grabbed my heavy wool winter coat and exited quietly through the side door of the laundry room, keeping to the narrow brick walkway hidden by the tall evergreen hedges Evelyn had planted decades ago. I walked 3 blocks to a bustling intersection and hailed a city cab, leaving my own vehicle parked securely in the driveway to maintain the perfect illusion that I was still napping inside the house. I directed the driver to a sleek, glass high-rise building located deep in the downtown financial district. I rode the private elevator to the 42nd floor and walked straight into the luxurious office of Lawrence Park. Lawrence was 65 years old, a towering, sharply dressed attorney with an intimidating reputation that made corrupt corporate executives tremble. We had collaborated on several high-stakes federal fraud cases during my career as an auditor. He was a brilliant, ruthless legal predator and precisely the ally I needed for this war. Lawrence stood up from his massive oak desk, extending a firm, powerful handshake. He did not offer any useless pity. He offered immediate action. I sat down and quickly laid out the events of the past 24 hours. I told him about the text message, the hidden cameras, and the mysterious entity named Evelyn's Historic Trust. Lawrence leaned back in his expensive leather chair, tenting his fingers together. I watched his sharp eyes narrow as he processed the terrifying information. He opened his secure terminal and began running specialized inquiries through the state property registry. While he worked, the memory of Evelyn's greatest secret washed over me. She had never been poor. Long before I met her, she had inherited a sprawling historic commercial lot in downtown Chicago from her grandfather. It was a massive piece of real estate anchoring a rapidly gentrifying financial district. Evelyn had deliberately kept it hidden from everyone, including our own daughter. She knew exactly what sudden, unearned wealth could do to a young mind. She wanted Morgan to build her own life, to understand the true value of a hard-earned dollar, rather than wait around for a massive inheritance to fall into her lap. We lived a quiet, modest life because Evelyn chose strong character over cold cash. Now that very property was the center of a massive criminal conspiracy. The rhythmic clicking of Lawrence's keyboard broke the heavy silence in the office. He pulled up a series of encrypted legal filings and turned his large monitor toward me. The bright glow of the screen illuminated a complex labyrinth of trust documents, property deeds, and transfer agreements. Evelyn's Chicago property had indeed been placed into a blind trust years ago, just as she had quietly arranged. But the current management structure had been completely altered. Lawrence pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a heavily redacted digital file. According to the state registry, the sole managing authority of Evelyn's Historic Trust was transferred from the original neutral holding firm directly to your son-in-law. Bradley now holds complete unilateral control over the commercial lot. He has the absolute legal power to sell, lease, or leverage the property without your knowledge or consent. I stared at the bright screen, my forensic mind immediately dissecting the mechanics of the massive theft. I demanded to see the specific transfer document. Lawrence clicked open a high-resolution scan of the original legal contract. I scrolled down to the final page where the authorization signatures were located. There at the very bottom was Evelyn's signature. It looked authentic at first glance, capturing the sweeping, graceful loops and sharp angles of her distinct handwriting. But as a veteran forensic auditor, I had spent 40 years authenticating documents. I noticed the slight, unnatural hesitations, the uneven pressure points, the subtle ink inconsistencies that indicated someone had painstakingly traced her handwriting over a light box. Then my eyes darted to the official date stamped directly beneath the signature line. The breath left my lungs as if I had been physically struck in the chest. The date of execution was exactly 3 days before Evelyn passed away. I closed my eyes as the painful memory of that agonizing week rushed back with violent, absolute clarity. 3 days before my wife died, she was not sitting in a pristine lawyer's office, signing over her grandfather's legacy to a man she barely tolerated. 3 days before she died, Evelyn was lying in a sterile hospital bed in the intensive care unit. The aggressive cancer had spread to her brain, causing unbearable suffering. The oncology team had placed her in a medically induced coma to grant her a peaceful, painless transition. She was completely unresponsive, hooked up to heavy ventilators and beeping intravenous monitors. It was medically, biologically, and legally impossible for her to have signed that document. Lawrence watched my face harden into stone. He already knew the grim implications. "The signature is a blatant, calculated forgery," I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet whisper. Bradley did not just manipulate a clever legal loophole. He committed severe felony document fraud. Lawrence quickly began drafting strict subpoenas and evidence preservation requests, typing with relentless military precision. He promised to quietly pull the hospital visitor logs from that specific week and secure a top-tier handwriting expert to officially dismantle the forged signature. I thanked him and left the office, descending the elevator with a mind that felt completely detached from my physical body. I walked the busy city streets, blending perfectly into the rushing lunchtime crowd, acting like a ghost walking among the living. The sheer audacity of Bradley's crime was staggering, but a much darker, more insidious thought began to claw at the delicate edges of my sanity. Bradley could not have pulled this off entirely alone. During those final heartbreaking days in the intensive care unit, access to Evelyn's room was strictly restricted by hospital security. Only immediate family members were allowed past the nurse's station. I was there almost constantly, holding her fragile hand and praying for an impossible miracle. But there were small windows of time when I stepped out into the hallway to speak with the doctors or grab a bitter cup of hospital coffee from the cafeteria. During those brief necessary absences, only one other person was consistently sitting by her bedside: my daughter Morgan. The horrific realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Did my own flesh and blood help orchestrate this forgery while her mother was dying? Did Morgan stand guard at the hospital room door, watching the sterile hallway while her husband traced her mother's signature onto a fraudulent document? Or worse, did Morgan hold the heavy pen herself, selling out her mother's legacy while the life slowly faded from Evelyn's body? The sickening feeling in my gut transformed into a blazing, highly focused fury. I had spent decades unmasking arrogant white-collar criminals who stole millions from faceless corporations. Now the worst criminals were sitting at my own dinner table, drinking my wine and plotting my immediate eviction. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. I needed to look my daughter directly in the eyes and see if there was any humanity left, or if unchecked greed had completely consumed her soul. I hailed a cab back to my quiet neighborhood, my plan crystallizing with cold, absolute certainty. I would invite Morgan out for coffee tomorrow afternoon. I would play the vulnerable, grieving father desperately seeking comfort. I would lay out the perfect bait and wait to see if my own child would sink her sharp teeth into the trap. The time for passive observation was over. The silent counter-offensive had officially begun. I called Morgan the following morning, making sure my voice sounded thin, fragile, and slightly desperate. I invited her to a quiet bistro downtown, the exact kind of unassuming place Evelyn and I used to take her when she was a little girl. She arrived 20 minutes late, marching through the glass doors wrapped in an expensive beige trench coat, a heavy designer handbag slung over her arm. She did not apologize for her tardiness or offer a warm greeting. She simply slid into the booth across from me, ordered a black coffee, and checked her gold watch. I folded my hands on the wooden table, letting a deliberate, noticeable tremor shake my fingers. I looked down at my lukewarm soup and sighed deeply, painting the perfect picture of an old man terrified of his fading independence and diminishing mental capacity. "Morgan," I began, my voice cracking just enough to sound authentic. "I have been going over the utility bills and property taxes lately. Everything is rising, and my pension barely covers the essentials. I have been having these strange, vivid dreams about your mother recently. Dreams where she tells me she left a safety net for us, a hidden account, or maybe a small property. Did she ever mention anything to you before she passed?" Morgan stopped stirring her coffee. She set the silver spoon down with a sharp, aggressive clink that echoed over the quiet hum of the restaurant. Her eyes, so much like Evelyn's, but completely devoid of her warmth, narrowed into a cold, dismissive glare. She looked at me, not with the compassion of a daughter, but with the distinct annoyance of an inconvenienced manager dealing with a confused employee. "Dad, we have been over this a dozen times," she snapped, her tone dripping with venomous condescension. "Mom was a romantic, but she was terrible with money. She left nothing but old hospital bills and debt. There is no secret safety net. There is no hidden fortune. You are letting your imagination run wild again. And frankly, it is getting exhausting to deal with. Stop being delusional, Dad. You need to face reality and accept that you are struggling." She took a slow sip of her coffee, completely unfazed by the cruel weight of her own words. She did not offer to help pay the rising taxes. She did not offer a comforting hand or a reassuring smile. She only offered a harsh, calculated lie meant to keep me entirely in the dark. The confirmation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My own daughter was fully complicit. She was actively protecting the forged trust guarding the stolen millions while looking her allegedly struggling father right in the eye without a single ounce of guilt. The rest of the lunch proceeded in suffocating, uncomfortable silence. Morgan spent the duration answering text messages on her phone, clearly eager to escape my presence and return to her glamorous life. When the waitress finally brought the check, I fumbled with my wallet, pulling out exact change with slow, agonizing, clumsy movements. Morgan rolled her eyes with an exaggerated huff and stood up, slinging her coat over her shoulder. "I need to use the restroom before I head back to the office," she announced abruptly, leaving her oversized designer handbag sitting wide open on the leather booth seat. It was the perfect, undeniable opportunity. I waited exactly 3 seconds until she disappeared around the corner of the narrow hallway. My clumsy, trembling hands instantly became as steady and precise as a veteran surgeon's. I reached into the deep pocket of my thick wool cardigan and pulled out a tiny matte black device. It was a military-grade micro-audio transmitter equipped with a real-time GPS tracker, a highly restricted piece of surveillance equipment I had acquired during my years working alongside federal investigators. It was smaller than a coin, practically invisible to the untrained eye, and possessed a battery life that would last for weeks. I leaned across the table and swiftly slipped the device deep into the inner zippered lining of her expensive leather bag, pushing it down until it lodged firmly near the bottom seam. I smoothed the fabric back into place and sat down, resuming my posture of a defeated, tired old man just a fraction of a second before Morgan walked back into the dining area. She grabbed her bag without a single glance, completely unaware that she was now carrying a live microphone broadcasting directly to my secure network. "I will call you this weekend, Dad," she lied effortlessly, not even offering a goodbye hug. "Try to get some rest. And please, stop obsessing over Mom's finances. It is not good for your blood pressure." I nodded meekly, thanking her for her time, and watched her march out of the restaurant and step into a sleek black luxury sedan. I remained in the booth for another 10 minutes, finishing my cold soup in total silence. The raw grief of losing my daughter to sheer, unadulterated greed was heavy, a suffocating weight pressing down on my lungs. But the forensic auditor inside me felt an electrifying surge of cold, highly focused energy. The bug was successfully planted. I had effectively breached their inner circle. The digital tether connecting her movements and private conversations to my encrypted laptop was now active. I paid the bill, stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, and headed straight back to my study. The board was set, and I was about to hear exactly what the enemy was planning behind closed doors. Later that evening, the house was perfectly still, enveloped in the quiet, comforting darkness of the suburbs. I sat locked inside my study, the heavy curtains drawn tight, the bright glow of my encrypted laptop illuminating the room. I wore high-fidelity noise-canceling headphones, listening intently to the live audio feed transmitting from Morgan's handbag. For hours, I heard nothing but the mundane sounds of her day, the rapid clicking of her office keyboard, the dull roar of city traffic, the sharp clatter of her heels on marble floors. But shortly after 8 o'clock, the ambient noise shifted to the muffled, distinct acoustics of a moving vehicle. She was in the car, driving home. A few moments later, the electronic chime of her car's Bluetooth system echoed through the feed. She was making a phone call. Bradley's voice came through the speakers, crisp, clear, and dripping with arrogance. "How was the lunch with the old man?" he asked, his tone laced with dark amusement. I held my breath, gripping the edge of my mahogany desk so hard my fingers ached. Morgan let out a sharp, cruel laugh that made my blood run absolutely cold. It was pathetic, she sneered, her voice devoid of any familial warmth or empathy. He was shaking like a leaf, rambling about Mom leaving us a secret fortune. I shut him down immediately and made him feel crazy for even bringing it up. "I told you the old man is losing it. His mind is practically gone." Bradley chuckled, a sinister sound that validated every terrible suspicion I harbored. "Good," Bradley replied smoothly. "The faster his brain turns to mush, the easier this gets for us. Did you bring up the nursing home facility yet?" Morgan sighed impatiently. "Not yet. We need to handle this systematically so the state does not get suspicious. Get the medical power of attorney ready by tomorrow morning. Once we force him to sign it, we can declare him legally unfit and liquidate his house too. That property should fetch at least $500,000 in this market, and we desperately need the extra cash to cover the transition fees for the commercial lot before the buyers finalize the paperwork." The call ended with a sterile electronic click. I slowly took off my headphones and placed them gently on the desk. The silence in the study felt incredibly heavy, pregnant with the gravity of what I had just heard. My own daughter, the child Evelyn and I had raised with boundless, unconditional love, was eagerly plotting to strip me of my home, steal her mother's legacy, and lock me away in a facility just to pad her husband's pockets. Any lingering trace of paternal hesitation evaporated instantly into the dark room. My heart turned to pure, unbreakable ice. The gloves were completely off. The era of the grieving, forgiving father was officially over, and the era of absolute ruin was about to begin. The very next morning, the cold Chicago wind bit at my face as I walked through the heavy brass doors of my local bank. I bypassed the standard teller line and walked directly into the glass office of Mr. Thompson, the senior branch manager. I had known him for over 15 years. He was a sharp, meticulous professional who respected my background as a forensic auditor. I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk and slid a heavily codified financial request toward him. I did not need to explain family drama or personal heartache. I only needed to speak the cold, hard language of banking security. I instructed him to open a highly restricted decoy account, a financial honeypot. I transferred exactly $100,000 from my primary pension fund into this isolated account. It was a substantial amount of money, precisely enough to tempt a greedy, desperate man, but safely walled off from the rest of my actual life savings. However, the money itself was completely irrelevant. The true weapon was the security protocol I instructed Mr. Thompson to attach to the routing number. I utilized a specialized banking regulation normally reserved for high-risk corporate assets. We rigged the account with a silent algorithmic trigger. Any outbound wire transfer exceeding $5,000 would instantly freeze the funds and automatically generate a suspicious activity report directly to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It would not alert the user. It would simply flag the transaction as a high-priority federal wire fraud attempt and immediately notify the appropriate federal authorities. Mr. Thompson reviewed the paperwork, his brow furrowing in concern as he processed the severe implications of the setup. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses and asked if I was absolutely certain I wanted to lay such a dangerous digital snare. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was expecting a rat to break into my vault very soon. I signed the authorization forms with a perfectly steady hand. The trap was now buried deep within the banking mainframe. It was invisible, lethal, and waiting patiently for a thief to blindly walk right into it. I did not have to wait long for the rat to take the bait. Barely 48 hours later, Bradley arrived at my front door unannounced. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy suit and carrying a stack of my mail he had supposedly picked up from the porch box. He walked into my living room projecting the sickeningly sweet aura of a deeply concerned son-in-law. He sat down next to me on the sofa, letting out a heavy, exaggerated sigh as he placed the envelopes on the coffee table. "Howard," he began, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Morgan and I have been talking, and we are just so worried about you. You seem so overwhelmed lately. We know how stressful managing a household can be, especially when your memory is not quite what it used to be." I immediately slumped my shoulders, staring blankly at the envelopes. I forced my hands to shake slightly as I picked up a standard electricity bill. I squinted at the numbers, muttering under my breath about how the math was confusing and how I kept forgetting which checks I had already mailed. Bradley leaned in closer like a vulture circling a wounded animal. His expensive cologne was suffocating, but I endured it, keeping my gaze fixed on the paper. "You do not have to struggle like this anymore, Howard," he said, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. His touch made my skin crawl, but I remained perfectly still. "Let me help you carry this burden. I can set up an online portal for you and manage these monthly payments. You have worked hard your entire life. You should be resting, not stressing over due dates and late fees. Just give me the access credentials to your checking account, and I will make sure everything is taken care of automatically." It was a masterful performance of predatory manipulation. He was using my feigned weakness to slip his hands directly into my pockets under the guise of familial charity. He wanted to secure control of my liquid cash before pushing forward with the medical power of attorney. He wanted to drain my accounts dry so I would have absolutely no resources left to fight back when they finally tried to lock me away in a facility. I let out a long, defeated sigh, playing the part of a broken, exhausted old man who had finally surrendered to his own cognitive decline. I slowly nodded my head, maintaining the fragile illusion of complete surrender. "You are a good man, Bradley," I whispered, injecting just enough vulnerability into my voice to make it sound entirely genuine. "I am just so tired." I walked over to my desk with slow, shuffling steps. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a small, wrinkled notepad where I supposedly kept all my important passwords written down. I fumbled with my reading glasses, intentionally dropping them once on the desk before finally copying the specific login credentials onto a sticky note. I did not give him the keys to my actual life savings. I handed him the exact routing number, account ID, and password to the honeypot account I had established with Mr. Thompson. Bradley took the yellow sticky note from my trembling hand. I watched closely as his eyes scanned the login details. A dark, triumphant glint flashed across his pupils. He pressed his lips tightly together, desperately trying to suppress the greedy, arrogant smirk threatening to break across his face. He carefully folded the note and slipped it deep into the breast pocket of his tailored suit, treating it like a winning lottery ticket. "Do not worry about a single thing, Howard," he assured me, standing up and buttoning his jacket with a renewed sense of arrogant authority. "I will get all of this sorted out for you tonight. You just relax." I watched him walk out the front door and strut confidently down the driveway toward his luxury car. His posture was triumphant, his steps light and victorious. He honestly believed he had just outsmarted a senile old fool. He thought he had successfully gained the ultimate access to drain my resources and fund his desperate criminal lifestyle. I stood by the window watching his taillights disappear down the street, and the frail, trembling old man persona instantly vanished. My posture straightened, and a cold, hard resolve settled deep into my bones. Bradley thought he was walking away with the keys to my kingdom. He had absolutely no idea that he had just grabbed a live federal grenade. The moment he attempted to move that money, he would detonate a wire fraud investigation that would completely destroy his life. The bait was taken. The countdown had officially begun. I walked back into my study, locking the door behind me. I opened my encrypted laptop and brought up the silent monitoring dashboard tied to the decoy funds. All I had to do now was sit back in the shadows and watch him dig his own inescapable grave. The deceptive calm of my house was shattered early the next afternoon by the sharp, aggressive ringing of the front doorbell. I was sitting in my study reviewing the encrypted digital logs of the decoy account when the sudden noise interrupted my focus. I quickly minimized the secure windows, locked the laptop, and shuffled toward the foyer. When I opened the heavy wooden door, my daughter Morgan pushed her way inside without waiting for an invitation. Close behind her stepped a man I had never seen before. He was a tall, imposing figure with slick dark hair, wearing an expensive charcoal suit entirely unsuited for a casual house call. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and carried himself with an air of practiced arrogance. Morgan did not offer a hug or a pleasant greeting. She crossed her arms and stared at me with a look of manufactured concern that made my stomach churn. "Dad, this is Dr. Gallagher," she announced, her voice deliberately loud and condescending, as if she were speaking to a small child. "He is a top-tier neurologist. Bradley and I arranged for him to come over to do a routine cognitive wellness check. We just want to make sure you are staying healthy." It was a complete ambush. They had not scheduled an appointment or asked for my consent. They brought a hired gun directly into my living room to fabricate the medical evidence they desperately needed. Dr. Gallagher did not even offer to shake my hand. He immediately walked into my living area, sat down in my favorite armchair, and opened his briefcase. He pulled out a stack of clinical assessment forms and a silver pen. "Have a seat, Howard," he commanded, gesturing to the sofa opposite him. "We are going to go through a few simple exercises." I sat down, letting my shoulders slump heavily. The doctor did not establish a baseline or build any rapport. He instantly launched into a relentless barrage of leading, highly manipulative questions designed to disorient and confuse. He asked me to recall a sequence of unrelated words, but interrupted me mid-sentence with rapid-fire questions about my late wife's medical history. He asked me to identify the current date and time, but spoke over me before I could finish my sentence, intentionally creating a highly stressful environment meant to induce a panicked, flustered response. He handed me a blank piece of paper and asked me to draw the face of a clock showing a specific time, but he kept tapping his pen against a clipboard, rushing me. As a former forensic auditor, I recognized exactly what he was doing. This was not a medical evaluation. This was a hostile interrogation designed to force a failure. I knew exactly what role I needed to play to survive this ambush and secure the ultimate evidence against them. I leaned deeply into the performance of a terrified, deteriorating old man. I let my hands tremble violently as I held the pen, dragging the tip across the paper to draw a misshapen, illegible circle. When he asked me to repeat the sequence of words he had given me earlier, I intentionally stammered, mixing up the order and substituting completely wrong phrases. I looked up at Morgan, projecting raw vulnerability and desperate confusion into my eyes. I was silently begging my own daughter to intervene to stop this aggressive stranger from harassing her father. Morgan simply stood by the fireplace, her arms still crossed, watching my fabricated humiliation with a cold, triumphant smirk. She was thoroughly enjoying the spectacle, completely convinced that my mind was broken beyond repair. What neither of them knew was that tucked safely inside the left breast pocket of my thick wool cardigan right next to my folded handkerchief was the same military-grade micro-audio recorder I had used to bug Morgan's handbag. It was switched on, capturing every single manipulated question, every stammered answer, and every piece of fraudulent medical theater occurring in my living room. After 30 agonizing minutes, Dr. Gallagher loudly snapped his clipboard shut with an exaggerated sigh. He looked at Morgan and shook his head with a perfectly rehearsed look of grave clinical concern. "I am afraid the cognitive decline is quite severe," he stated firmly, his voice ringing through the quiet room. "The dementia has progressed rapidly. He requires immediate constant supervision." Morgan covered her mouth, feigning a tragic gasp, but her eyes sparkled with greedy victory. I slumped back into the sofa, resting my face in my trembling hands, acting completely defeated. Dr. Gallagher stood up and signaled for Morgan to follow him into the kitchen for a private conversation. They assumed I was too lost in my own confusion to pay any attention to them. I waited exactly 10 seconds before silently lifting myself from the cushions. I shuffled quietly toward the kitchen doorframe, pressing my back against the wall. The sensitive microphone in my pocket easily picked up their hushed, urgent whispers. "The paperwork is done," Dr. Gallagher muttered, his professional tone completely vanishing, replaced by the sharp demand of a hired mercenary. "I have signed the official declaration of incompetence. My fee is $10,000. Morgan did not hesitate. "Bradley will wire the money to your offshore account tonight," she whispered back eagerly. "Just make sure the court seals are airtight. We cannot afford any delays with the judge." I stood in the shadows, recording the absolute destruction of their lives. I quietly retreated to the sofa, ensuring I was exactly where they had left me by the time Morgan and the corrupt doctor walked back into the living room. They offered a few more fake, patronizing words of comfort before swiftly exiting the house. The moment the front door latched shut, I reached into my pocket and turned off the recording device. My heart was pounding with a mixture of profound sorrow and electrifying vindication. I immediately walked into my study, locked the door, and connected the recorder to my encrypted laptop. I listened to the crystal-clear playback of the kitchen conversation. I had just captured a definitive recorded confession of a felony medical bribe. It was a silver bullet that would not only send Dr. Gallagher to federal prison and strip him of his medical license, but would also directly implicate Morgan and Bradley in a massive criminal conspiracy. I secured the audio file in 3 separate encrypted cloud vaults and forwarded a copy directly to my attorney, Lawrence Park. However, as I stared at the blinking cursor on my monitor, the chilling reality of my situation settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I had the ultimate proof of their fraud, but they had exactly what they came for. Dr. Gallagher's official sign-off gave Bradley the precise legal ammunition he needed. With a certified medical document declaring me legally incompetent, Bradley did not need to wait another day. That fraudulent piece of paper was the golden key to the family court system. He now possessed the unchecked power to file an immediate petition for emergency guardianship. Once a judge granted that petition, my autonomy would be legally stripped away. Bradley would gain total, absolute control over my bank accounts, my property, and my medical decisions. He would have the authority to lock me in a psychiatric facility and sell Evelyn's historic commercial lot without a single legal hurdle blocking his path. The timeline had just accelerated dramatically. The threat was no longer a distant looming shadow. It was an imminent strike. I knew Bradley was arrogant enough to march straight to the courthouse the moment that $10,000 bribe cleared. The trap I had laid in the honeypot account was primed, but I was now standing on the edge of a razor-thin wire. I had to outmaneuver a desperate man who held a loaded legal weapon aimed directly at my head. The ultimate confrontation was rushing toward me, and I had to prepare for absolute war. The very next evening, the stakes of this silent war shifted dramatically from bureaucratic legal maneuvering to sheer physical endangerment. I was sitting in the dark solitude of my study, reviewing the encrypted digital logs of my honeypot account, when I heard the unmistakable faint click of the back door unlocking. The security cameras I had secretly integrated into my own private network caught the intrusion immediately. It was Bradley. He slipped into the house with the practiced, quiet stealth of a seasoned burglar bypassing the heavy deadbolt with a spare key Morgan must have provided him. He did not call out my name or announce his arrival in any normal capacity. I remained perfectly still in my leather chair, watching his live high-definition feed on my monitor. He crept into the kitchen, his movements purposeful and highly hurried. I knew exactly what was running through his desperate mind. A fraudulent medical evaluation was a powerful legal tool, but shrewd family court judges could still demand independent verification or assign an impartial court evaluator to review the case. Bradley needed a catalyst. He needed a terrifying, undeniable physical incident that proved to the state that I was in immediate critical danger to myself and my surrounding neighborhood. He walked straight to my vintage gas stove. I watched in cold, absolute fascination as he pulled a small, heavy metal wrench from the inside pocket of his tailored jacket. He reached behind the appliance and deliberately clamped the tool onto the primary gas valve. It was a calculated lethal adjustment. He did not disconnect the pipe entirely, which would be too obvious to any casual investigator. He simply applied enough torque to loosen the brass fitting, ensuring a slow, steady leak that would gradually fill the kitchen and the adjoining living room with highly combustible fumes. A single spark from the refrigerator compressor kicking on, or a simple flick of a light switch, could ignite the vapor and level the entire property. He wiped the wrench carefully on a dish towel, slid it back into his pocket, and exited the house just as silently as he had entered. He left me sitting in my own home, essentially trapped on top of a live explosive device. He was fully willing to risk my painful death to secure his financial inheritance. The sharp, unmistakable odor of mercaptan began to drift down the hallway within minutes of his departure. The rotting egg smell was chemically designed to trigger immediate human panic, to make an elderly homeowner call their family in a state of wild hysterics or stumble blindly through the dark house trying to find the source. If I were the frail, deteriorating man they thought I was, I would have frantically dialed Morgan's number, providing them with the exact panicked audio recording they needed to rush a judge into granting emergency guardianship. I would have played right into their hands, validating the fake neurologist report with my own terrified behavior. Instead, I remained perfectly calm. I did not touch a single light switch or electrical outlet. I did not use my cell phone inside the house to avoid any microscopic risk of a static spark. I walked purposefully through the rooms, opening every single window and exterior door to create a massive cross breeze, flushing the explosive, invisible gas out into the cold night air. Once the house was thoroughly ventilated and the immediate danger was neutralized, I stepped out onto my back patio and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. I did not call the local fire department or the municipal utility company. A standard emergency response would result in a generic incident report citing an old man's accidental negligence, which was exactly the official narrative Bradley was counting on. I dialed a private, unlisted number I had kept from my days investigating corporate sabotage. I called a certified forensic mechanical inspector, a brilliant man who specialized in investigating arson and high-level insurance fraud for federal agencies. He arrived at my house within the hour, bringing a heavy protective case of advanced diagnostic equipment. I led him directly to the kitchen and pointed to the stove. I told him I needed a legally binding microscopic analysis of the primary gas valve. He went to work immediately without asking unnecessary questions. He dusted the brass fitting for tool marks, photographed the distinct microscopic striations left by Bradley's wrench, and measured the exact torque required to loosen the factory seal. He confirmed exactly what I already knew. The valve had not failed from age wear or accidental bumping. It had been aggressively and intentionally tampered with by someone using a specific tool. He took detailed macro photographs of the fresh metallic scratches, bagging the physical swab evidence with strict chain of custody protocols. I paid him his premium emergency fee in cash. I now possessed undeniable, scientifically backed proof of a physical attack. By noon the following day, the official forensic report arrived securely in my encrypted inbox. The document was an absolute masterpiece of objective scientific analysis. The inspector had outlined every technical detail of the tampering, concluding with a bold, underlined statement citing intentional mechanical sabotage. There was absolutely zero ambiguity in his findings. The fresh scratches on the brass fitting perfectly matched the grip of a standard pipe wrench, and the significant physical force required to break the tight factory seal entirely ruled out any possibility of accidental loosening by an elderly man. I immediately forwarded the encrypted document directly to Lawrence Park. We had a brief, chilling phone call that changed the entire trajectory of our counteroffensive. Lawrence informed me that we were no longer just building a case for financial fraud, elder abuse, or medical bribery. The moment Bradley took a wrench to that highly explosive gas line, he had crossed a terrifying criminal threshold. He had deliberately created a lethal environment in an occupied dwelling, knowing full well I was inside. The charges had officially escalated to attempted manslaughter. The sheer gravity of the situation was immense and sobering. My son-in-law was not just a greedy parasite trying to manipulate a trust fund and steal Evelyn's legacy. He was a desperate, violent criminal willing to actively murder me to cover his tracks and pay off his massive underground debts. He thought he was incredibly clever, setting the stage for a tragic domestic accident that would leave Morgan a wealthy, grieving daughter and him the undisputed master of the historic commercial lot. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his reckless actions had just handed me the ultimate weapon to guarantee his absolute destruction. With the forensic report added to our rapidly expanding legal dossier, the trap was now fully armed with severe federal and criminal charges. Bradley was walking around the city making phone calls and planning his $25 million real estate deal, completely unaware that he was a dead man walking. The board was perfectly set. The final confrontation was hurtling toward us with unstoppable momentum, and I was fully prepared to pull the trigger on his total annihilation. The heavy encrypted phone in my pocket vibrated with a single urgent text message from Lawrence Park. It did not contain pleasantries or a casual greeting. It simply read to be at his downtown office within the hour, and to ensure I was absolutely not followed. I left my house immediately, taking a complex route involving 2 different city buses and a cash-paid taxi, to guarantee Bradley had no idea I was on the move. When I walked into Lawrence's sprawling corner office, the usual pristine mahogany desk was completely buried under mountains of financial dossiers, bank records, and thick manila folders. Lawrence was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the Chicago skyline with a grim, deeply troubled expression. He turned around as I locked the door behind me and motioned for me to sit down. He did not mince words. He slapped a heavily redacted file onto the center of the desk. He told me he had spent the last 48 hours leveraging every single contact he had in the Federal Financial Crimes Division and the State Tax Board to completely dissect Bradley's background. The polished, arrogant son-in-law who constantly flaunted his expensive tailored suits and bragged about his prestigious family lineage was a total absolute fraud. His old money family had quietly gone bankrupt over a decade ago. Their entire estate had been liquidated to pay off massive corporate negligence fines. Bradley had zero legitimate family wealth. He was a hollow shell playing the role of a successful real estate magnate while floating on a terrifying mountain of toxic debt. But the bankruptcy was not the reason Lawrence had called an emergency meeting. The true horror of Bradley's situation was far darker and infinitely more dangerous. Lawrence pulled out a series of surveillance photographs and unauthorized bank statements. Bradley had attempted to rebuild his family fortune by investing heavily in illegal offshore real estate ventures. When traditional banks refused to lend him a single dime, he turned to the dark, undocumented corners of the financial world. He had borrowed heavily from a ruthless, highly organized underground syndicate operating out of the East Coast. Through years of accrued interest, penalty fees, and failed investments, Bradley currently owed the syndicate exactly $15 million. He was not just a greedy man trying to steal his late mother-in-law's inheritance to buy luxury cars. He was a dead man walking. The syndicate did not send polite collection letters. They sent enforcers. Bradley was entirely backed into a corner, drowning in a lethal debt that he could never hope to pay back through legitimate means. Lawrence opened a second folder, pushing a printed ledger across the desk toward me. This document explained the mystery of the $2 million that had been illegally drained from Evelyn's historic trust. It was the exact transaction that had triggered the notification on Bradley's phone the night of the disastrous family dinner. That massive sum of money was not tucked away in a retirement account or used to buy property. It was a desperate, frantic down payment wired directly to shell companies controlled by the syndicate. Bradley had stolen the initial $2 million simply to buy himself a temporary stay of execution. It was blood money paid to keep the mob from breaking his legs or throwing him into the trunk of a car. But the syndicate was running out of patience. Lawrence pointed to a heavily encrypted email intercepted by his federal contacts. The underground lenders had issued an absolute non-negotiable ultimatum. Bradley had exactly 14 days to deliver the remaining $13 million, or they would make a violent public example out of him. The ticking clock explained every single piece of erratic, aggressive behavior I had witnessed over the past few weeks. It explained why Morgan and Bradley were so desperate to declare me medically incompetent. It explained the fake neurologist, the hidden cameras, the intentional gas leak, and the blatant forgery of Evelyn's signature. But more importantly, it explained the ultimate target. The historic commercial lot in downtown Chicago that Evelyn had left behind was conservatively valued at $25 million. Lawrence revealed that Bradley had already engaged in secret, unauthorized negotiations with a massive global tech conglomerate. The conglomerate wanted to purchase the entire lot to build a new corporate headquarters. They were ready to wire the full $25 million in cash. But commercial real estate transactions of that magnitude require ironclad legal authorization. The buyer's legal team was demanding the final signatures from the managing director of the trust. Bradley had the forged documents giving him initial control, but the title company required clear, uncontested authority. If I were still legally autonomous, I could easily contest the sale and tie the property up in probate court for years. Bradley needed me legally neutralized, erased from the financial equation, and locked inside a psychiatric facility so he could sign the final closing documents without a single legal hurdle. He had precisely 2 weeks to close the $25 million deal, pay off his $15 million debt to the criminal syndicate, and walk away with the remaining $10 million as pure, unadulterated profit. If he failed, the tech conglomerate would walk away and the mob would undoubtedly kill him. I sat in the heavy leather chair, letting the monumental weight of this revelation settle over me. The entire perspective of the battlefield had instantly shifted. Bradley was not a calculating, evil genius operating from a position of power. He was a terrified, cornered animal acting out of pure, unfiltered panic. The loosened gas valve in my kitchen was not just a greedy attempt to speed up an inheritance. It was an act of frantic desperation from a man staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. Desperate men do desperate, unpredictable things, and Bradley was rapidly running out of options. My initial plan was to simply expose his fraud and send him to federal prison for a few years. But as I looked at the timeline presented by Lawrence, a much colder, far more punishing strategy crystallized in my mind. I was no longer just fighting to protect my money or defend my late wife's legacy. I was in a position to perfectly orchestrate his absolute ruin. If I confronted him now or went to the police with the gas leak evidence, he would be arrested, but he might find a way to plea bargain or escape the wrath of his creditors while safely locked inside a protective custody cell. I did not want him to feel safe. I wanted the crushing weight of his own decisions to completely suffocate him. I realized that my greatest weapon was not the forensic evidence I had gathered. My greatest weapon was time. I had the power to dictate the exact pace of this war. I told Lawrence that we were going to let the clock run. We were going to let Bradley believe his plan was working flawlessly. We would let him sweat through every single day of his 2-week deadline, feeling the agonizing pressure of the syndicate closing in around him. We would let him arrange the final meeting with the tech conglomerate and bring the massive $25 million deal to the absolute edge of completion. I was going to time the trap so perfectly that the jaws would snap shut on him at the exact moment he thought he had won. I wanted him to feel the money slipping through his fingers just as the federal agents and the syndicate both arrived at his doorstep. Howard, the grieving father, was dead. Howard, the forensic auditor, had transformed into an executioner. The 14-day countdown had officially begun, and I was going to ensure that every single second dragged him closer to total, inescapable destruction. I booked a first-class ticket on the earliest flight out of the city the very next morning. I left the house long before the sun came up, ensuring my absence would not trigger any alerts on the surveillance cameras Bradley was so diligently monitoring. My destination was Chicago, the beating heart of Evelyn's hidden legacy and the current epicenter of Bradley's desperate financial lifeline. The flight was short, but it gave me the necessary quiet to mentally prepare for the corporate fortress I was about to breach. I was not walking into a courtroom or a local police station. I was walking into the global headquarters of Apex Vanguard, a massive tech conglomerate with a legal defense budget larger than the gross domestic product of some small nations. Their towering glass and steel skyscraper dominated the downtown skyline, projecting an aura of absolute impenetrable power. I walked through the revolving doors and approached the vast marble reception desk. The security protocols were exactly as rigorous as I expected. 2 armed guards flanked the elevators, and the receptionist politely but firmly informed me that the chief executive officer, Mr. Sterling Vance, did not take unannounced walk-in meetings under any circumstances. I did not raise my voice or act like a confused elderly man lost in the big city. I reached into my tailored suit and produced a single sealed envelope alongside my old platinum credentials from the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I instructed the receptionist to deliver the envelope directly to Mr. Vance's chief legal counsel. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper detailing the exact routing numbers of the offshore syndicate accounts Bradley was using intertwined with Apex Vanguard's pending acquisition contract. I knew the corporate lawyers would instantly recognize the catastrophic legal exposure of a wire fraud investigation. Barely 7 minutes later, a senior executive assistant rushed into the lobby, her face entirely drained of color. She bypassed the security checkpoint and escorted me directly to the private express elevator. I was ushered into a sprawling corner office on the 60th floor where Sterling Vance stood behind a massive, polished concrete desk. He was a ruthless billionaire accustomed to controlling every variable in his universe. He checked his watch and bluntly informed me I had exactly 10 minutes to explain why I was threatening to freeze his flagship real estate acquisition. I placed my briefcase on his desk and told him I was not there to threaten his company. I was there to save him from a federal indictment. I unclasped the brass latches of my briefcase and spread the forensic dossier across his pristine desk. I did not waste a single second on emotional appeals or familial betrayals. I spoke the cold, absolute language of liability and federal compliance. I slid the high-resolution scan of the trust transfer document toward him, followed immediately by the certified hospital records detailing the exact dates of Evelyn's medically induced coma. I explained the forensic analysis of the forged signature, breaking down the mechanical impossibility of the authorization. Sterling Vance picked up the documents, his sharp eyes scanning the medical timelines and the glaring discrepancies in the handwriting. The arrogant impatience in his posture evaporated instantly, replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. But I was not finished. I pulled out the secondary ledger provided by Lawrence Park and placed it directly in front of him. I detailed Bradley's crushing $15 million debt to the East Coast Syndicate. I explained that the initial $2 million Bradley had already extracted from the trust was wired directly into criminal shell accounts. I watched the realization hit the billionaire CEO like a freight train. If Apex Vanguard transferred $25 million to finalize the purchase of the historic lot, that money would instantly be swallowed by an illegal underground syndicate. The tech conglomerate would be directly facilitating massive corporate money laundering. They would become the primary target of a federal racketeering investigation, and their shareholders would face catastrophic losses. Vance threw the forged contract onto his desk with a violent, disgusted motion. He was absolutely furious. His team of highly paid corporate lawyers and real estate acquisition experts had failed to detect the massive fraud lurking just beneath the surface of the deal. He had almost handed over tens of millions of dollars to a desperate, bankrupt parasite attempting to pay off violent loan sharks. He reached for his desk phone, his knuckles white, ready to call his legal team and instantly kill the entire acquisition. He wanted to crush Bradley with the full weight of his corporate attorneys and report the attempted fraud to the authorities immediately. He was a man who eliminated threats the second they appeared, and Bradley had just become a massive, unacceptable liability. I reached across the desk and firmly pressed my hand down on the telephone receiver, stopping him before he could make the call. I looked the furious billionaire dead in the eye and told him that simply backing out of the deal was not the optimal solution. I explained to Mr. Vance that simply canceling the acquisition would only trigger a panic response. Bradley would instantly know the forgery had been discovered. He would likely flee the country to escape the syndicate, or worse, he would accelerate his violent legal and physical attacks against me out of sheer desperation. I proposed a far more definitive strategy. I wanted to build a trap so inescapable that Bradley would willingly walk into it and lock the door behind himself. I offered the CEO a binding guarantee. Once Bradley was entirely removed from the picture and legally neutralized, I would personally authorize the sale of the historic lot to Apex Vanguard for the exact same $25 million price tag. There would be no renegotiations, no delays, and absolutely zero legal ambiguities. The title would be pristine. In exchange, I needed Vance and his army of corporate lawyers to play along. They needed to pretend the acquisition was proceeding flawlessly. I wanted them to schedule the final closing meeting at their most prestigious downtown office. I wanted them to invite Bradley to sit at the head of the conference table, feeling like the absolute master of the universe. I needed them to place the final transfer deeds in front of him and hand him the pen. The moment Bradley physically signed those closing documents, believing he was executing a $25 million wire transfer, he would be committing undeniable documented federal fraud. He would be doing it on high-definition corporate security cameras surrounded by expert witnesses. Vance listened to my proposal with absolute silence. The anger in his eyes slowly transformed into a cold, calculated respect. He recognized the brutal efficiency of the trap. He agreed to the terms without a single moment of hesitation. We shook hands, sealing a devastating alliance between a retired forensic auditor and a billionaire chief executive. I packed my briefcase and walked out of the towering glass skyscraper, feeling the tremendous momentum of the impending destruction. Bradley was currently sitting in my house dreaming of his massive payday and counting the days until his syndicate debt was erased. He had absolutely no idea that the very people he thought he was manipulating had just formed a lethal coalition against him. The final stage was beautifully, perfectly set. We were going to hand him the rope and politely wait for him to tie the knot around his own neck. I returned from Chicago late that evening, slipping back into my house under the cover of darkness. The alliance with Sterling Vance was completely solidified, but I knew Bradley and Morgan were operating on a terrifyingly tight deadline with the underground syndicate. Desperation was a powerful motivator, and it drove them to act with sloppy, aggressive haste. The very next morning, my front door swung open with aggressive force. Morgan marched into the living room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She did not bring groceries or ask about my day. She dropped a thick stack of brightly colored brochures directly onto the coffee table right in front of my teacup. I stared at the heavily manipulated marketing materials. They were printed on cheap paper, advertising restrictive state-funded assisted living facilities on the bleak outskirts of the city. These were not luxury retirement communities tailored for comfort. They were sterile, low-tier institutions designed to warehouse the elderly, medicate them into silent compliance, and strip them of their basic human rights. My daughter and her husband were actively plotting to steal a $25 million commercial property, yet they were entirely unwilling to spend more than the bare minimum to lock me away. Morgan sat across from me, crossing her arms with a look of extreme manufactured disappointment. "We need to talk about your living situation, Dad," she announced, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Bradley and I have been discussing the gas leak incident. You left the primary stove valve completely open. If the pilot light had caught you, would have leveled the entire block and killed yourself in the process." I stared at the brochures, my mind flashing back to the forensic reports safely locked in my encrypted files that proved Bradley had taken a heavy steel wrench to that very valve. She was using her husband's attempted manslaughter as a performance review of my mental competence. "It was just a small mistake," I muttered, playing the defensive, embarrassed old man. Morgan slammed her hand flat against the table, startling me intentionally. "It was not a small mistake," she snapped, leaning forward with predatory aggression. "It was a catastrophic failure of basic cognitive function. You are in immediate danger to yourself and everyone around you. You cannot live alone anymore. It is completely irresponsible for us to allow you to stay in this house." She pushed a brochure for a facility named Oakwood Pines toward me. It promised 24-hour lockdown supervision and highly restricted visitation rights. She wanted to throw me into a sterile cage, strip away my cell phone, and lock the heavy doors so Bradley could finalize the massive theft without a single interruption. I picked up the Oakwood Pines brochure with deliberately trembling hands. I looked at the depressing stock photos of heavily sedated elderly patients staring blankly out of barred windows. The sheer audacity of her scheme was breathtaking. She was attempting to discard her own father like broken, obsolete furniture. I needed to look my daughter in the eye one final time. I needed to offer her one last microscopic chance for redemption before I pulled the heavy lever that would obliterate her entire existence. I lowered the pamphlet and looked directly into her cold, calculating eyes. "Morgan," I said, my voice thick with genuine emotion, though not the emotion she assumed. "I built this house with my own 2 hands. Your mother and I brought you home from the hospital to this very room. We painted your nursery together. We sacrificed our own comfort for decades so you could attend the best schools and wear the nicest clothes. Is this truly what you want to do to me?" I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence fill the living room. For a fraction of a second, I searched her face for any microscopic flicker of hesitation, any hidden reserve of empathy that might prove my daughter was still alive inside that hollow designer shell. "Is this what your mother would have wanted?" I asked softly. The mention of Evelyn's name did not soften her posture. It did not provoke a single shred of guilt, shame, or familial loyalty. Instead, Morgan's expression hardened into a rigid mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. She sneered at me, a look of profound disgust twisting her features. "Do not try to guilt-trip me with Mom," she hissed, her tone icy and razor-sharp. "Mom is dead. She is gone, and her outdated working-class morals died right along with her. Face reality, Dad. You are a failing, dangerous old man who cannot even manage a basic kitchen appliance without nearly causing a catastrophic explosion. You belong in a facility where professionals can supervise you. Bradley and I have massive financial transitions to handle, and we cannot be burdened by babysitting a massive liability." The absolute cruelty of her words echoed off the walls of the house her mother had loved so deeply. She was entirely, completely gone. The little girl who used to hold my hand while we walked through the park had been entirely consumed by arrogance, entitlement, and bottomless greed. She had actively chosen the parasite she married over the father who had given her life. Any lingering trace of paternal mercy I held in my heart evaporated in that exact second. The invisible sacred tether that bound a father to his child was permanently severed, sliced clean through by her own vicious entitlement. The father who had desperately hoped for a misunderstanding, who had prayed for a chance to forgive, was permanently dead. I was now operating with the cold, mechanical precision of a federal executioner. I let my shoulders slump forward, collapsing into the sofa as if the sheer weight of her cruel words had physically broken my spirit. I dropped the glossy brochure back onto the coffee table and covered my face with my hands, letting out a long, pathetic sigh of total surrender. "You are right," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly frail, hollow, and utterly defeated. "I am just so tired, Morgan. My mind is not what it used to be. I cannot fight this anymore. If you truly believe this sterile facility is the best place for me, I will go. I will go upstairs and pack my bags right now." Morgan let out a sharp, triumphant breath, the tension completely drained from her posture, replaced by a radiant, victorious glow. She had successfully bullied her father into absolute submission. She believed she had just cleared the final annoying obstacle blocking her path to a multi-million-dollar payday. "It is for your own good, Dad," she replied, her voice instantly returning to that sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone. "I will have Bradley come by tomorrow to help you move your things. We will take care of the house. You just focus on resting." She stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from her expensive coat, and marched out the front door without a single backward glance. I listened to the sharp click of the lock closing behind her. I slowly lowered my hands from my face. My tears were non-existent. My posture straightened instantly, the fragile old man vanishing into thin air. Morgan thought she had just won the ultimate war. She thought her manipulation had secured her a lifetime of limitless wealth and zero accountability. She had absolutely no idea that my surrender was the final critical mechanism required to activate the trap. By agreeing to leave the house without a legal fight, I was giving Bradley the ultimate green light. I was giving him the unearned confidence to formally file the emergency guardianship petition with the family court and eagerly schedule the final real estate closing with Sterling Vance. The board was perfectly arranged. The bait was swallowed whole. The trap was now fully, irreversibly primed, and tomorrow they were going to walk blindly into a federal slaughterhouse. I spent the next morning sitting in my armchair, deliberately staring at the blank television screen, ensuring my posture was appropriately slumped for Bradley's hidden cameras. I knew the moment Morgan left the house, Bradley would waste absolutely no time. His timeline was suffocating him, and my manufactured submission was the only green light he needed. The confirmation came just before noon via a secure encrypted text from Lawrence Park. Bradley had just filed an ex parte petition for emergency temporary guardianship in the county family court. He submitted the fraudulent neurological evaluation signed by Dr. Gallagher alongside the police report detailing the hazardous gas leak incident. He painted a terrifying picture of a rapidly deteriorating elderly man who was an immediate violent threat to himself and the surrounding community. He requested full, absolute authority over my medical decisions, my physical living arrangements, and most importantly, my entire financial portfolio. The family court system designed to protect the vulnerable moves with terrifying speed when presented with imminent danger. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for exactly 48 hours later. The sheer audacity of the filing was staggering, but it was also precisely what I had anticipated. Bradley was attempting to execute a legal coup d'etat. He was using the very system designed to protect the elderly to strip me of my constitutional rights. The stakes of this impending hearing were absolute and irreversible. If the presiding judge glanced at the fabricated medical report, noted the gas leak incident, and granted the temporary guardianship, Bradley would instantly become my legal master. He would have the court-sanctioned authority to forcibly remove me from my own home and lock me inside the sterile walls of Oakwood Pines without my consent. But the physical confinement was merely a necessary byproduct of his true objective. The moment the judge's ink dried on that order, Bradley would possess the unilateral legal power to sign any document on my behalf. He would completely bypass the title company's requirement for my signature on the $25 million commercial real estate sale. He could sit at the polished conference table with Sterling Vance, sign the final closing documents as my court-appointed guardian, and authorize the immediate wire transfer of the funds. The money would flow directly into the offshore shell accounts controlled by the East Coast Syndicate, erasing his $15 million debt and leaving him with a massive, untraceable profit. I would be trapped in a locked ward, heavily medicated and completely stripped of the resources required to mount a legal defense. Evelyn's legacy would be annihilated, and my daughter would be living comfortably on the spoils of my execution. I met Lawrence Park later that afternoon in a secluded booth at a quiet diner on the edge of town, far away from any surveillance cameras. Lawrence slid a thick manila folder across the table containing copies of Bradley's emergency petition. He looked at me with a rare expression of genuine concern. "Howard, we have everything we need right now," Lawrence stated, his voice low and urgent. "We have the forensic report proving the gas leak was sabotage. We have the audio recording of Dr. Gallagher accepting the $10,000 bribe. We have the financial logs proving the syndicate debt. I can march into the judge's chambers this afternoon, present this evidence ex parte, and have the entire guardianship petition thrown out before the hearing even begins. We can have Bradley arrested for fraud and attempted manslaughter by dinner time." I looked down at the legal documents detailing my supposed mental incompetence. I thought about Morgan looking me in the eye and coldly telling me her mother's morals were dead. I thought about Bradley taking a wrench to my gas line, fully willing to blow my house to pieces just to expedite his payday. Stopping the hearing privately in the judge's chambers would certainly protect my assets, and it would send Bradley to prison. But it would be a quiet, sterile victory. It would not provide the absolute public destruction they deserved. It would not expose their arrogance in the very arena they thought they controlled. I slid the folder back across the table. "No, Lawrence," I replied, my voice completely devoid of hesitation or mercy. "If we stop it now, they will spin a narrative of a misunderstanding. They will claim the doctor made an honest mistake and the gas leak was just a coincidence. I want them to dress up in their expensive suits. I want them to stand in front of a judge and swear under oath that they are acting out of love and concern. I want them to commit perjury on the public record. Let them walk into that courtroom feeling like absolute, untouchable victors. We are not going to stop the hearing, Lawrence. We are going to let them build their own gallows, and then we are going to bury them in front of the judge." Lawrence stared at me for a long moment, recognizing the cold, lethal finality in my strategy. A slow, sharp smile spread across his face. He closed the folder and nodded. "The trap remains set. We will see them in court." The evening before the emergency guardianship hearing, a brutal storm rolled into the city, but the most violent turbulence was happening inside Bradley's polished downtown office. He sat alone at his heavy glass desk, the city lights reflecting off the sweat beading on his forehead. His phone vibrated violently against the glass, displaying an encrypted text message from a blocked international number. The message was terrifyingly brief and devoid of any professional courtesy. It stated that the syndicate's patience had officially expired. They were fully aware of his pending $25 million real estate deal, but they demanded an immediate show of good faith to guarantee he was not planning to flee the country. They demanded a $50,000 wire transfer by midnight, or they would pay a personal, highly physical visit to Morgan at her boutique downtown fitness studio the very next morning. Bradley stared at the glowing screen, his perfectly curated facade crumbling into sheer, unadulterated panic. He was literally hours away from securing complete legal control over my estate. Once the judge signed the guardianship order tomorrow morning, he could authorize the sale of the historic lot, clear his massive underground debt, and walk away a wealthy man. But he absolutely needed to survive the night. He checked his personal accounts. They were completely drained, leveraged to the absolute limit to maintain his luxurious lifestyle and pay for the fraudulent neurologist. He had absolutely zero liquid cash available. Desperation clouded his judgment, silencing any lingering sense of caution or legal self-preservation. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out the small, wrinkled yellow sticky note I had handed him days earlier. It contained the exact routing number, account ID, and password to my supposed primary pension fund. He rationalized the theft instantly, convincing himself it was just an early minor withdrawal from an estate that would legally belong to him in less than 12 hours. He did not view it as a severe felony crime. He viewed it as a necessary temporary survival tactic. He powered up his secure laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard with frantic, greedy urgency, completely unaware that he was stepping directly into the center of a perfectly constructed digital snare. Bradley navigated to the banking portal, typing in my credentials with arrogant, unchecked speed. The screen loaded, displaying the $100,000 balance resting safely in the decoy account. A greedy, profoundly relieved smile stretched across his face. He saw exactly what I wanted him to see: a vulnerable pool of cash sitting completely unprotected, entirely ripe for the taking. He quickly set up a new external transfer, routing the funds through a complex web of intermediary financial institutions designed to obscure the final destination. He inputted the routing number for an offshore shell account based in the Cayman Islands, the exact drop point mandated by the ruthless East Coast syndicate. He typed in the transfer amount of $50,000. He did not hesitate. He did not pause to consider the massive digital footprint he was leaving behind on his own personal computer network. He moved the mouse over the bright blue confirmation button and clicked it with a heavy, decisive strike of his index finger. The banking portal displayed a generic loading wheel for 3 agonizing seconds before flashing a bright green checkmark, confirming the transaction was successfully initiated. Bradley let out a massive, shuddering breath, slumping back into his expensive leather chair, utterly convinced he had just bought himself the crucial time he needed to finalize his ultimate theft tomorrow morning. However, beneath the smooth, user-friendly interface of the banking portal, a highly sophisticated sequence of catastrophic events had just been irrevocably activated. The exact moment that green checkmark appeared, the transaction hit the silent algorithmic tripwire Mr. Thompson and I had buried deep within the routing code. The $50,000 transfer was instantly intercepted and frozen in a digital holding pattern by the bank's automated security matrix. Simultaneously, an encrypted high-priority alert bypassed standard banking protocols and shot directly into the mainframe of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The automated system packaged Bradley's IP address, his device identifier, the exact timestamp of the unauthorized login, and the illegal offshore destination routing number into a comprehensive, undeniable digital dossier. The alert flashed directly on the monitors of federal agents working the night shift at the Financial Crimes Division. They immediately recognized the distinct signature of a massive illicit international wire fraud attempt. A federal case file was automatically generated, assigning an active investigation number to Bradley's digital identity. The trap did not just snap shut. It locked, bolted, and completely sealed him inside a federal cage. I was sitting quietly in my dimly lit study, nursing a glass of sparkling water, when my encrypted phone chimed with a sharp, distinct notification tone. It was the specific alert I had configured to monitor the honeypot account. I set my glass down on the heavy mahogany desk and picked up the device. The screen displayed a secure automated message directly from Mr. Thompson. The text confirmed that an outbound international wire transfer of $50,000 had been successfully initiated using my login credentials, and the federal fraud protocols had been fully and irreversibly engaged. I stared at the bright white text, a cold, profound sense of absolute victory settling deep into my chest. The timing was almost poetic. Bradley was a desperate, foolish man who could not wait a single night to secure his own safety. His sheer arrogance and blind panic had driven him to commit a perfectly documented felony on a heavily monitored federal banking network. The wire fraud was completely locked in. There was absolutely no way for him to cancel the transaction, erase the digital server logs, or claim it was a simple administrative error. The federal authorities now possessed an immutable, legally binding record of his crime, directly tying his personal device to an illegal offshore syndicate drop. The pieces of the chessboard were now locked in their final lethal positions. Bradley was undoubtedly sitting in his office right now, pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch, celebrating his narrow escape, and dreaming of his impending multi-million-dollar payday. He was preparing his tailored suit and practicing his solemn, deeply concerned expressions for the courtroom tomorrow. He firmly believed he was about to enter the family court as an untouchable king, ready to conquer a fragile old man and claim his sprawling kingdom. He was completely, blissfully unaware that he was no longer a respected real estate developer or a clever manipulator. He was already a federally wanted man. The silent alarm had been tripped, the federal agents were mobilized, and the invisible crosshairs were locked squarely on his chest. I turned off my phone, stood up from my desk, and walked to the window to look out over the quiet, sleeping neighborhood. Tomorrow morning, Bradley and Morgan would march into the courthouse expecting a swift, entirely uncontested victory. I was going to let them stand before the judge, present their fabricated lies, and claim their false throne just seconds before the full, devastating weight of the federal government crashed down upon their heads. The heavy oak doors of the county family courthouse swung open, echoing with a resounding thud that signaled the beginning of the final act. The air inside the sterile, windowless room was thick with tension and the suffocating smell of institutional floor wax. I did not walk down the center aisle. I was pushed through the doorway, seated in a bulky metal wheelchair, my posture violently curved inward to project the ultimate image of physical and mental collapse. I wore a slightly oversized, wrinkled cardigan, and I let my chin rest against my chest, my eyes intentionally vacant and glassy. Beside me walked my attorney Lawrence Park, who had brilliantly dialed back his usually predatory legal aura. He carried a thin, unassuming manila folder, playing the part of a defeated, overwhelmed public defender going through the motions of an unavoidable tragic formality. Across the aisle, sitting at the polished petitioner's table, were my daughter and my son-in-law. They had dressed with meticulous, sickening precision. Morgan wore a conservative, high-necked charcoal dress, her hair pulled back into a severe, practical bun. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her hands, her eyes artificially reddened to project the image of a heartbroken, exhausted daughter bearing the crushing weight of her father's tragic decline. Bradley sat close to her, wearing a subdued navy suit that carefully downplayed his usual arrogant flashiness. He placed a comforting, steady hand over Morgan's shoulder, acting the role of the devoted, supportive husband anchoring his family through a devastating crisis. They looked absolutely flawless. They were a pristine catalog, perfect portrait of familial tragedy and selfless devotion. Watching them from beneath my lowered brow, my forensic mind dissected every microscopic detail of their performance. Bradley adjusted his tie, and for a fraction of a second I saw his hand tremble. It was not a tremor of sorrow. It was the residual, terrified vibration of a man who had frantically wired $50,000 to an illegal offshore syndicate just hours prior. He was sitting in a court of law surrounded by bailiffs and legal officials, completely convinced that his midnight felony was safely buried in the digital ether. He believed this hearing was a mere administrative hurdle, a final annoying formality before he could sprint to the finish line, claim his $25 million prize, and save his own life. I kept my hands folded limply in my lap, suppressing the cold, electrifying surge of absolute power coursing through my veins. The stage was perfectly set, the actors were strictly adhering to their miserable scripts, and the theater of their ultimate destruction was officially in session. The presiding official, Judge Patricia Gomez, a stern but notoriously empathetic magistrate known for her stringent protection of vulnerable seniors, took her seat at the high wooden bench. She adjusted her reading glasses and called the hearing to order. Bradley had hired a ruthless, highly expensive family law attorney named Richard Vance, a man whose polished silver hair and soothing baritone voice were specifically weaponized to manipulate compassionate judges. Vance stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and approached the center podium with an expression of profound manufactured sorrow. "Your Honor." Vance began, his voice echoing with a perfectly calibrated tone of reluctant necessity. "We are here today not out of malice, but out of a desperate, urgent need to protect a man from his own rapidly deteriorating mind." He gestured sympathetically toward my wheelchair, treating me as if I were already a ghost haunting the courtroom. Vance systematically unpacked the fabricated dossier of my supposed insanity. He submitted the fraudulent neurological evaluation signed by Dr. Gallagher into the official court record. He read the clinical damning paragraphs aloud, emphasizing the fabricated diagnostic conclusions of severe, irreversible dementia and violent cognitive fragmentation. He painted a terrifying, highly convincing picture of an elderly man who was no longer tethered to reality, wandering through his house in a state of dangerous delirium. But Vance did not stop at mere medical speculation. He moved swiftly to the physical evidence, presenting the police and fire department reports regarding the gas leak at my property. "Your Honor, This was not a simple lapse in memory. Vance continued, raising his voice to ensure the gravity of the accusation saturated the courtroom. Mr. Howard left the primary valve of a highly combustible gas stove completely open. Had it not been for the sheer luck of ventilation, he would have incinerated his own home and potentially killed dozens of innocent neighbors sleeping in adjacent properties. He is an immediate, critical, and undeniable danger to the community and to himself. My client, his daughter, has spent sleepless nights terrified that she will receive a phone call announcing her father's fiery death. Vance walked back to the petitioner's table and placed a reassuring hand on Morgan's desk. Morgan executed her cue perfectly, letting out a soft, heartbreaking sob that echoed through the quiet courtroom, burying her face in her tissue. Bradley rubbed her back, looking up at the judge with an expression of stoic, desperate pleading. Vance concluded his argument by formally requesting that the court immediately strip me of all medical and financial autonomy, transferring absolute unchecked legal guardianship directly to Bradley. He framed the hostile, predatory takeover of my entire life savings and Evelyn's multi-million-dollar legacy as an act of profound, selfless familial charity. The courtroom fell into a heavy, stifling silence as Mr. Vance took his seat. The atmosphere was thick with the manufactured tragedy they had successfully woven. I kept my head down, my eyes fixed firmly on the polished wooden floorboards, maintaining the illusion of a hollow, uncomprehending shell of a man. Judge Gomez leaned forward over the high bench, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked down at the extensive, damning paperwork spread out before her, the fraudulent medical signatures, the manipulated emergency reports, the carefully crafted narrative of my utter incompetence. She then shifted her gaze directly toward Morgan. The judge's stern, authoritative expression visibly softened, melting into a look of deep, profound maternal sympathy. "Mrs. Morgan," the judge said, her voice gentle and accommodating, "I oversee dozens of these tragic cases every single month. I know the immense agonizing pain of watching a brilliant, loving parent slip away into the dark shadows of cognitive decline. You and your husband are doing the brave, responsible, and necessary thing here today by stepping in to protect him when he can no longer protect himself." I felt Lawrence Park shift slightly in the chair next to me, his posture remaining deceptively relaxed, but his sharp legal mind coiling like a venomous snake, preparing to strike. Judge Gomez reached across her heavy desk and picked up her official gold-plated fountain pen. She brought it down to hover just millimeters above the final signature line of the emergency guardianship order. If she completed that single sweeping stroke of ink, my legal autonomy would be instantly eradicated, and Bradley would legally inherit the keys to the $25 million commercial lot. At that precise, terrifying second, Bradley turned his head slightly away from the judge. He looked directly across the narrow aisle, locking his arrogant, predatory eyes right onto mine. Believing he was entirely shielded from the judge's view, he let his mask of sorrow slip. A cold, vicious, unapologetic smirk stretched across his face. It was the victorious, mocking grin of a parasite who firmly believed he had just successfully drained the lifeblood from his host. He thought he had outsmarted a federal auditor, bypassed a multi-million-dollar trust, and secured his permanent escape from a violent underground syndicate. The illusion of his absolute, undeniable victory filled the quiet room, expanding until it felt like an impenetrable fortress of lies. He had no idea that I was not looking at a conqueror. I was looking at a dead man, and the real trial was only just beginning. The golden tip of Judge Gomez's fountain pen was a millimeter away from the crisp white paper when a voice shattered the heavy silence of the courtroom. "Objection. Your Honor." The words were not shouted, but they carried a sharp, concussive force that echoed off the high, vaulted ceiling. Lawrence Park stood up from his chair beside me, his posture instantly transforming from a defeated public defender into a towering apex predator. Judge Gomez froze her pen, hovering motionless in the air. She looked up, her sympathetic expression instantly replaced by sharp judicial annoyance. "Mr. Park, this is an emergency ex parte hearing for the immediate safety of your client," she warned, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. "You had better have a highly compelling reason to interrupt this proceeding." "I do, Your Honor," Lawrence replied, walking confidently toward the center podium, carrying the thin manila folder that he had kept casually resting on his lap. "The narrative you have just been presented is a complete, elaborate fabrication. My client is not suffering from dementia. He is not a danger to himself or his community. He is the victim of a highly organized, hostile takeover." Lawrence opened his folder and extracted a thick stack of documents stamped with heavy official seals. He approached the bench and handed them directly to the court clerk. Your Honor, those are comprehensive independent cognitive evaluations conducted over the past 72 hours by 3 separate state-appointed board-certified neurologists. I submitted the request for these independent evaluations, quietly masking them under a routine insurance inquiry to prevent interference. The results are unanimous and undeniable. Mr. Howard is not merely competent. His cognitive function, memory retention, and analytical reasoning are functioning at a level far above the average metric for a man of his age. He possesses the sharp, highly capable mind of a veteran forensic auditor. Bradley's triumphant smirk instantly dissolved into a rigid mask of absolute terror. He shot a frantic, bewildered look at his high-priced attorney, Richard Vance. Vance leaped to his feet, his smooth composure cracking. Your Honor, this is highly irregular, Vance protested, his booming voice now tinged with genuine panic. We submitted a certified medical report from Dr. Gallagher, a respected specialist who personally examined the respondent in his own home. Lawrence did not even look at Vance. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the judge. Yes, Your Honor, he agreed smoothly. Dr. Gallagher did indeed visit my client's home, and that brings me to my second piece of evidence. Lawrence reached into the breast pocket of his suit and pulled out a small black digital audio player. He connected it to the courtroom's primary audio-visual system via a simple auxiliary cable. Your Honor, my client is a retired investigator who spent 40 years dismantling complex financial fraud. When uninvited hostile actors entered his home, he relied on his professional training. Operating well within the boundaries of our state's one-party consent recording laws, he activated a personal recording device to document a suspected crime. Lawrence did not wait for Vance to formulate another desperate objection. He pressed the play button. The crystal-clear, high-fidelity audio recording filled the silent courtroom. First came the unmistakable, arrogant voice of Dr. Gallagher declaring that the paperwork was done and the declaration of incompetence was signed. Then came the devastating, fatal demand. My fee is $10,000. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the gallery. But the recording was not finished. Morgan's distinct, sharp voice echoed from the speakers, eager and entirely devoid of hesitation. Bradley will wire the money to your offshore account tonight. Just make sure the court seals are airtight. We cannot afford any delays with the judge. Lawrence pressed a button, stopping the playback. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed was absolute. Morgan sat completely frozen at the petitioner's table, the color draining so rapidly from her face she looked like a polished marble statue. She stared blankly ahead, unable to process the reality that her own voice had just confessed to a severe federal felony on the public judicial record. Richard Vance, the expensive powerhouse attorney, physically stumbled backward, dropping his pen onto the table. He turned incredibly pale, looking at Bradley and Morgan with a mixture of profound shock and extreme professional disgust. He realized in a fraction of a second that his clients had not just lied to him. They had actively used him to present forged medical documents and solicit a fraudulent court order. Vance was a ruthless lawyer, but he was not a criminal. He knew his own law license, and his freedom were now in catastrophic jeopardy. Judge Gomez sat absolutely motionless behind her elevated bench. The maternal sympathy she had shown Morgan only moments earlier had been completely incinerated. Her eyes darkened with a cold, terrifying judicial fury. She looked down at the forged medical document sitting on her desk, handling it as if it were a highly contagious disease. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice dangerously quiet and tightly controlled. Care to explain why your clients just admitted to bribing a medical professional to defraud this court? Before Vance could even attempt to salvage his burning career, Bradley violently pushed himself up from his chair. The polished, arrogant facade he had meticulously maintained for weeks violently shattered. He pointed a shaking, erratic finger directly at me, his face contorted into a mask of wild, desperate panic. That is a lie, he shouted, his voice cracking as it bounced off the courtroom walls. That audio is completely fabricated. It is an illegal, manipulated recording. He is trying to frame us. Bradley slammed his fist onto the wooden table, losing all sense of courtroom decorum. Look at him, Your Honor. He is a vindictive, manipulative old man. He intentionally sabotaged his own gas line to set us up. He is trying to destroy his own daughter because he is completely paranoid and delusional. You cannot admit that recording into evidence. It is a desperate trick. Judge Gomez slammed her heavy wooden gavel down with explosive, deafening force. The sharp crack instantly silenced Bradley, cutting his frantic outburst short. "Sit down immediately, Mr. Bradley," she commanded, her voice ringing with absolute uncompromising authority. "One more outburst of that nature and I will have my bailiffs hold you in contempt and place you in a holding cell. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Bradley slowly sank back into his chair, swallowing hard, his chest heaving with panicked, ragged breaths. He looked at Morgan, who was openly weeping now, but she refused to make eye contact with him. The illusion of their flawless victory had not just slipped away. It had been brutally and publicly executed. Lawrence Park remained standing at the center podium, perfectly calm, completely unfazed by Bradley's hysterical meltdown. He adjusted his suit jacket, projecting the quiet, lethal confidence of a man who held all the winning cards. "Your Honor," Lawrence said, his voice smooth and remarkably steady, "we have clearly established that my client is of perfectly sound mind. We have established that the medical evidence presented by the petitioners was obtained through bribery and extreme fraud. However, I understand the court must weigh the totality of the circumstances regarding the gas leak and the financial motivations driving this deeply disturbing petition." Lawrence turned slightly, looking directly at Bradley, ensuring the desperate man heard every single word of his impending doom. "Therefore, Your Honor," Lawrence continued, turning his attention back to the judge, "we have one final witness to call to the stand today. This witness will definitively clarify my client's absolute competence and simultaneously expose the petitioner's true urgent motives for attempting to steal a $25 million estate." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open just as Lawrence finished his sentence. But before the final witness stepped across the threshold, I decided it was time to end the physical charade I had maintained for agonizing weeks. I had spent the last month shuffling through my own hallways, allowing these parasites to dictate my routine and mock my perceived fragility. I had swallowed their condescension and endured their fake medical evaluations. That agonizing performance was officially over. I gripped the armrests of the bulky metal wheelchair and pushed myself up. I did not struggle. I did not tremble. I stood up with perfect rigid posture, smoothing the wrinkles from my oversized cardigan and deliberately removing it to reveal a sharply tailored charcoal suit underneath. The frail, deteriorating old man vanished instantly into the sterile courtroom air, replaced by a veteran forensic auditor who had spent 4 decades dismantling criminal empires. I stepped away from the wheelchair and stood tall beside Lawrence, my eyes locking directly onto Bradley. The shock that rippled through the room was palpable and absolute. Judge Gomez widened her eyes, leaning over the high mahogany bench in sheer astonishment. Bradley shrank back into his chair, his jaw dropping as the horrifying realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. He had never been manipulating a helpless victim. He had been a clueless pawn in my game the entire time. "Your Honor," I said, my voice booming with a deep, unwavering resonance that commanded absolute attention. "I apologize for the theatrical entrance. However, when my son-in-law installed hidden surveillance cameras inside my private residence and actively attempted to cause a lethal gas explosion, I determined that playing the role of a senile target was the only secure method to independently gather the evidence required to expose his massive criminal syndicate. I did not need a guardian. I needed a trap, and the man sitting at the petitioner's table willingly walked right into it." Judge Gomez did not reprimand me for speaking out of turn. She simply nodded, gesturing for Lawrence to proceed with his final witness. The illusion of my vulnerability was completely shattered, leaving Bradley and Morgan entirely exposed to the devastating reality of their situation. The bailiff announced the name Sterling Vance. The billionaire chief executive officer of Apex Vanguard strode down the center aisle of the courtroom, projecting an aura of absolute impenetrable authority. He wore a custom-tailored suit and carried a sleek titanium briefcase. He took the witness stand, swore the oath, and adjusted the microphone with calm, lethal precision. Lawrence approached the stand, requesting Mr. Vance to identify his relationship with the petitioner. Vance looked directly at Bradley with an expression of profound corporate disgust. "My technology conglomerate has been in aggressive negotiations to acquire a highly valuable commercial property in downtown Chicago." Vance testified, his voice echoing with absolute clarity. "The property is owned by Evelyn's Historic Trust." The man sitting at that table, Bradley, attempted to execute a $25 million hostile takeover of that exact property to pay off a massive violent debt he owes to an illegal East Coast gambling syndicate. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs, but Sterling Vance did not pause for dramatic effect. He was a man who operated on facts, and he delivered them with the force of a sledgehammer. He opened his titanium briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of finalized legal contracts. He handed them directly to the court clerk to be submitted into evidence. Yesterday afternoon, Mr. Bradley sat in my corporate boardroom and signed these exact acquisition documents. Vance continued, his gaze pinning Bradley to his seat. He legally presented himself as the sole authorized managing director of the trust. He utilized a transfer document containing a blatantly forged signature of Mr. Howard's late wife. He signed the final closing papers on our high-definition corporate security cameras, fully believing he was authorizing a $25 million wire transfer to his offshore shell accounts. He committed severe documented federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft directly inside my headquarters. Bradley turned the color of ash. His expensive lawyer, Richard Vance, physically backed away from the table, severing all proximity to his client. Sterling Vance then submitted the final devastating piece of corporate evidence. He provided the judge with the exact offshore routing numbers Bradley had used, matching them perfectly to the illegal syndicate accounts Lawrence had already flagged. The narrative was inescapable. Bradley had not filed this emergency guardianship to protect a sick old man. He had filed it because he desperately needed to neutralize the only person who could legally contest his $25 million federal forgery. The crushing weight of the billionaire executive's testimony annihilated whatever tiny shred of hope Bradley still harbored. The walls of the courtroom were violently closing in on him. But before the judge could even address the catastrophic federal crimes that had just been confessed on the public record, Morgan suddenly jumped to her feet. The polished facade of the grieving daughter shattered into a wild, frantic display of pure self-preservation. She violently shoved her chair away from Bradley, putting as much physical distance between them as the small table allowed. "I did not know," she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing with desperate manufactured panic. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at her husband's face. "Bradley did this. He lied to me. He manipulated everything. I thought my father was genuinely sick. I had absolutely no idea he forged my mother's signature or owed money to a criminal syndicate. I am a victim here." She was throwing the man she married directly under a speeding freight train, desperately trying to swim away from a sinking ship. She looked up at Judge Gomez, tears of absolute terror streaming down her face, begging the court to view her as an innocent, naive bystander trapped in her husband's sinister web. I did not let her performance last another second. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through Morgan's hysterical sobbing like a razor blade. "My daughter is an exceptional actress, but she is a terrible liar." I connected my phone to the courtroom's audio-visual system. I did not need to explain the origin of the recording. I simply pressed play. The crystal-clear audio captured from the micro-transmitter I had planted inside Morgan's designer handbag filled the room. Morgan's own voice, cold, arrogant, and dripping with pure, unchecked greed, echoed from the speakers. "I told you the old man is losing it. Get the medical power of attorney ready by tomorrow morning. Once we force him to sign it, we can declare him legally unfit and liquidate his house too. That property should fetch at least $500,000 in this market, and we desperately need the extra cash to cover the transition fees for the commercial lot before the buyers finalize the paperwork." The recording clicked off, leaving a profound, suffocating silence in its wake. Judge Gomez looked at Morgan with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The maternal sympathy she had offered earlier was completely gone, replaced by the icy wrath of a magistrate who realized she had almost been used as an instrument of elder abuse. Morgan froze, her mouth hanging open, her desperate tears instantly drying up. The ultimate betrayal was now a matter of public judicial record. She had actively conspired to strip her father of his home, lock him in a facility, and assist in the laundering of her mother's stolen legacy. The entire courtroom stared at her in absolute revulsion. Morgan slowly sank back into her chair, utterly defeated, entirely stripped of her dignity and permanently silenced. The trap had not just caught the rat, it had caught the snake that invited him inside. The final reverberations of Morgan's recorded voice faded into the heavy oak panels of the courtroom. The silence that followed was not merely quiet, it was a suffocating vacuum that drained the oxygen directly from the lungs of the petitioners. Judge Patricia Gomez sat immobilized behind her elevated mahogany bench, staring down at the disgraced couple with a level of judicial fury that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. She slowly picked up the fraudulent medical evaluation that had been submitted as the foundation of this emergency petition and deliberately tore the thick document straight down the middle. The sharp ripping sound cut through the dead air like a gunshot. "Mr. Bradley," she began, her voice vibrating with a terrifying absolute rage. "In my 20 years presiding over family court, I have witnessed countless tragedies and familial disputes. But I have never in my entire career witnessed a more abhorrent, calculated, and predatory manipulation of the judicial system. You came into my courtroom wearing the mask of a devoted family member and attempted to use the authority of this bench as a weapon to execute a multi-million-dollar theft. You fabricated medical records, bribed a licensed physician, and attempted to strip a perfectly healthy, competent man of his fundamental human rights simply to line your own pockets." Morgan flinched violently, pressing her hands against her face, but the judge immediately turned her wrath toward my daughter. "And you, Mrs. Morgan," the judge continued, her tone dripping with absolute disgust. "You conspired to sell your own father's autonomy for a real estate transaction. You are a disgrace to the very concept of family." Judge Gomez stood up from her leather chair, grabbing her heavy wooden gavel. She did not tap it lightly. She brought it down with a bone-rattling strike that finalized their absolute ruin. "I am dismissing this emergency guardianship petition with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am holding you both in direct contempt of court for submitting forged evidence and committing blatant perjury under oath." Bradley scrambled backward in his chair, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. He realized the legal proceedings had catastrophically backfired, and his first instinct was immediate cowardly flight. But Judge Gomez was already steps ahead of his panic. She pointed a rigid finger at the armed bailiffs stationed near the perimeter. "Bailiffs, secure all exits to this courtroom immediately," she commanded. "No one is permitted to leave this chamber." The heavy brass locks of the courtroom doors engaged with a loud, definitive clack. Bradley was completely trapped inside the very cage he had built for me. The moment the bailiffs secured the perimeter, a sharp, aggressive knock echoed from the other side of the locked double doors. Judge Gomez gave a swift nod of authorization, and the bailiff pulled the heavy doors open. A team of 5 individuals marched into the courtroom. They were not local police officers or court security. They wore sharp, dark suits and tactical vests emblazoned with the unmistakable, bold yellow lettering of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a relentless, calculating gaze, walked straight down the center aisle, bypassing the gallery and stopping directly behind the petitioner's table. He did not ask for permission to speak. He operated with the absolute supreme authority of the federal government. "Bradley," he announced, his voice projecting across the silent room like a physical blow. "I am Special Agent Miller with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. We have a federal warrant for your immediate arrest." Bradley stood up, his knees visibly buckling beneath him. His custom-tailored Navy suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his rapidly shrinking frame. "Arrest me for what?" He stammered, his voice pitching into a high, hysterical whine. "This is a family court matter. This is a misunderstanding about a real estate trust." Agent Miller pulled a thick stack of finalized federal warrants from his jacket. "This ceased being a family court matter last night at exactly 11:14, he stated, staring Bradley dead in the eye. "You initiated an unauthorized international wire transfer of $50,000 from a heavily monitored federal decoy account using a stolen digital identity. That transaction routed directly into a known offshore money laundering syndicate account in the Cayman Islands. You triggered a massive federal wire fraud investigation the second you hit confirm." Bradley's jaw dropped open, his breath hitching violently in his throat as the realization of his midnight mistake utterly destroyed him. But Agent Miller was not finished unpacking the devastating arsenal of charges. Furthermore, the agent continued, pulling out a second set of warrants. "We are charging you with aggravated identity theft, the creation and distribution of fraudulent federal medical documents, and severe elder financial abuse. We have also secured the security footage from Apex Vanguard headquarters, confirming your attempt to execute a $25 million commercial real estate sale using forged trust documents. You are looking at a multi-count federal indictment." Richard Vance, the expensive attorney who had represented Bradley just moments ago, physically stepped away from the table, raising his hands to demonstrate total non-compliance with his former client. He recognized that standing too close to a man hit with a federal racketeering and wire fraud charge would end his entire legal career. Bradley was entirely isolated, completely surrounded by armed federal agents and drowning in an ocean of undeniable, heavily documented evidence. The lead agent gestured to his subordinates. Two agents stepped forward, grabbing Bradley's wrists and twisting them forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed perfectly through the silent courtroom. The polished, arrogant facade of the old money real estate magnate shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Bradley let out a primal, desperate scream as the cold steel bit into his skin. His perfectly styled blonde hair fell wildly across his face and his eyes bulged with pure, unadulterated terror. He thrashed against the grip of the federal agents, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the polished floorboards, but his resistance was entirely useless. They held him with ironclad military precision, dragging him forcefully away from the table. It was a setup, he shrieked, spittle flying from his lips as he frantically turned to look at Morgan. "Morgan, do something! Tell them he set me up! Tell them he faked the account!" But Morgan remained glued to her chair, shrinking away from the flailing, pathetic man she had married. She offered him absolutely no salvation. Bradley then locked his wild, panicked eyes onto me. I remained standing tall beside Lawrence Park, my posture rigid and victorious. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at him with the cold, detached satisfaction of an auditor who had successfully balanced a highly corrupted ledger. "You planned this, you old parasite!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking in sheer hysteria as the agents dragged him backward down the center aisle. "You set the trap. You ruined my life." I did not respond to his chaotic, desperate accusations. He had ruined his own life the moment he decided my existence was an obstacle to his greed. The reality of his situation was far more terrifying than the federal prison sentence waiting for him. I knew the exact horrific mathematics playing out in his mind. He was facing 30 years behind federal bars for multi-count wire fraud and identity theft. But the federal government was the least of his immediate problems. The violent East Coast syndicate was still waiting for their $15 million debt. The $50,000 wire transfer had been frozen by my honeypot account, meaning the mob had received absolutely nothing. Bradley was being hauled off to a federal holding cell completely penniless and deeply indebted to ruthless killers. He was a dead man walking whether he remained behind bars or managed to post bail. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, and the agents shoved him through, dragging him out into the harsh, unforgiving reality of the public hallway. His muffled, pathetic screams echoed through the corridor, fading slowly into the distance. The absolute silence returned to the courtroom, leaving only the distinct, satisfying scent of total, absolute victory. The heavy brass doors slammed shut at the back of the courtroom, cutting off Bradley's frantic screaming. The deafening silence rushed back into the sterile chamber, settling heavily over the polished wooden benches and the cold marble floors. Judge Patricia Gomez gathered her thick legal files, gave me a single respectful nod of absolute acknowledgement, and swiftly exited through her private chamber doors. The gallery slowly emptied as the court bailiffs ushered the few remaining spectators and legal officials out into the public corridors. Within minutes, the massive room was entirely devoid of life except for Lawrence Park, myself, and the shattered, pathetic remains of my daughter. Morgan remained frozen at the petitioner's table, her expensive charcoal dress looking suddenly like a crumpled prison uniform. The protective, arrogant shell she had worn for decades was completely obliterated. The catastrophic reality of her immediate future was crashing down upon her in crushing, suffocating waves of panic. She was not just the wife of a federally indicted felon facing decades behind bars. She was a documented co-conspirator. The clear audio recording I had played for the judge permanently cemented her active role in elder abuse, medical bribery, and attempted property theft. She was facing severe felony complicity charges, total public humiliation, and absolute financial annihilation. The violent East Coast syndicate would soon be looking for their missing $15 million, and with Bradley locked inside a federal holding cell, Morgan was the only target left on the board. She slowly stood up, her knees knocking together so violently she could barely support her own weight. She stumbled out from behind the heavy wooden table, her designer heels scraping awkwardly against the polished floorboards. She practically threw herself across the narrow aisle, collapsing directly at my feet. She reached out with trembling, manicured hands and grabbed the heavy wool fabric of my suit jacket, gripping it with the desperate, frantic strength of a drowning sailor clinging to a life raft in a violent storm. "Dad," she sobbed. her voice cracking into a shrill, unrecognizable wail that echoed off the high walls. "Dad, please, you have to help me. You have to tell the federal agents I had nothing to do with the wire fraud. Bradley manipulated me from the start. He controlled all our finances. I was just scared and confused." She buried her face against my knees, weeping real hot tears of pure, unadulterated terror. "Please do not let them put me in federal prison. I will do anything you ask. I will publicly testify against him in court. I will sign whatever documents you want me to sign. Just please protect me. You are my father. You have to protect me." Her weeping echoed pitifully throughout the cavernous, empty courtroom, a pathetic display of sheer self-preservation. I looked down at the sobbing woman clutching my jacket. I did not flinch. I did not reach down to stroke her hair or offer a single comforting word of paternal forgiveness. I simply stood there as rigid and unyielding as a marble statue, projecting a level of cold, absolute detachment that finally forced her to look up. Her expensive mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks, ruining her flawless facade and staining her pale face. I stared directly into her terrified eyes, searching desperately for a shred of genuine remorse for the immense pain she had caused our family. I found absolutely nothing but the primal, frantic fear of a predator facing the immediate consequences of her actions. I slowly reached down and firmly pried her trembling fingers off my jacket, letting her hands drop uselessly back to the courtroom floor. "You sold your mother's legacy to a parasite?" I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that commanded total, unbreakable silence. "You invited a predator into our family, and you actively, eagerly helped him pick our bones clean. You did not just make a passive mistake, Morgan. You sat in my living room, looked me dead in the eye, and told me my morals were dead. You hired a corrupt doctor to fabricate a neurological disease so you could lock me inside a state-funded cage. You tried to erase my entire life, my freedom, and my dignity for a quick, convenient payout." Morgan gasped, shaking her head frantically from side to side as if she could somehow physically deny the undeniable truth I was laying before her. "Dad, no." She pleaded, her voice a pathetic, broken whisper. "I was trying to secure our future. I thought it was what we needed to survive his debts." "Your future," I corrected, my tone sharpening into a lethal, unforgiving blade. "You planned to steal a $25 million commercial property that Evelyn kept hidden to protect you from exactly this kind of toxic, unchecked greed. Your mother knew exactly who you were becoming. She knew you measured human worth solely by bank balances and designer labels. You had a choice when Bradley told you his plans. You could have warned me. You could have protected the father who spent his entire life working to give you every possible advantage. Instead, you planted hidden cameras in my home and eagerly plotted my absolute ruin. You do not get to play the victim now that the trap you helped build has snapped shut on your own neck. You are exactly where you belong. The daughter I raised, the girl your mother and I loved with all our hearts, died a long time ago. The selfish stranger kneeling on this floor is completely unrecognizable to me." Morgan let out a guttural, devastating cry, collapsing forward until her forehead pressed hard against the cold hardwood floor. She was completely broken, utterly defeated by the unvarnished, brutal truth of her own monstrous actions. But I was not finished. The ledger of her betrayal was not yet fully balanced. I turned slightly and extended my hand toward Lawrence Park. My attorney, who had stood silently observing the brutal, familial reckoning, opened his thin manila folder and extracted a single crisp sheet of legal paper. He handed it to me with a respectful, solemn nod. I held the document for a brief moment, feeling the immense, satisfying finality of what it represented. I dropped the paper, letting it flutter down to the floor, landing perfectly face up, inches from Morgan's tear-stained face. She slowly lifted her head, her red-rimmed eyes trying to focus on the bold, black text printed across the top of the page. It was a formal, legally binding eviction notice. Morgan stared at it, her breath hitching wildly in her throat, entirely unable to process this new, catastrophic development. "You have lived in that luxurious suburban house for 5 years, pretending to be a self-made success," I explained, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "But you never actually owned the deed. Bradley used a subsidiary holding company connected to your mother's original trust to purchase that property. He thought he was cleverly hiding his assets from his creditors. He actually placed the legal title directly into an entity that I completely control. I legally own the house you live in, Morgan. And as of this exact second, your tenancy is permanently terminated. You have exactly 30 days to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises before the county sheriff arrives to throw you and everything you own directly onto the street." Morgan gasped, pressing her hands tightly over her mouth as the ultimate realization of her total destitution crashed over her. But the final strike was yet to come. Furthermore, I continued stepping backward away from her kneeling form, distancing myself from her permanently. "You are officially disinherited. My will has been entirely restructured. You will not receive a single dime from my pension, from your mother's trust, or from the $25 million sale that will proceed without you. You are completely disowned. You have 30 days to find a way to survive the absolute wreckage you created." I turned my back on my daughter, buttoned my tailored suit jacket, and walked shoulder to shoulder with Lawrence Park down the center aisle of the courtroom. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors, leaving Morgan completely alone, sobbing hysterically on the floor of the empty chamber, surrounded by the absolute irreversible ruin of her own making. The weeks following the explosive courtroom confrontation unfolded with the rapid, merciless efficiency of a perfectly executed demolition. Bradley's high-priced defense attorney officially withdrew from the case less than 24 hours after the federal arrest. During the arraignment hearing, the federal judge reviewed the massive volume of wire fraud evidence and the offshore flight risk factors. Bail was unequivocally denied. Bradley was remanded directly to a maximum security federal detention center, forced to trade his tailored Navy suits for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. But the federal government was incredibly slow compared to the swift, brutal mechanics of the East Coast syndicate. The very night Bradley was locked in a holding cell, his creditors moved in to collect their unpaid $15 million debt. The repossession was systematic and terrifyingly thorough. The sleek luxury cars vanished from the driveway of the suburban estate before dawn. His remaining shell company accounts were aggressively drained, and his business associates immediately cut all ties, erasing his name from the corporate world as if he had never existed. Morgan experienced a similarly devastating freefall. Exactly 30 days after I dropped that eviction notice on the courtroom floor, the county sheriff arrived at her sprawling suburban fortress. She was physically escorted off the property with nothing but 2 suitcases of clothes. The designer handbags and expensive jewelry had already been pawned to cover her immediate legal fees for her complicity defense. Today she resides in a damp, windowless room at a cheap roadside motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. A private investigator I kept on retainer sent me a final batch of photographs last week. They showed my daughter wearing a stiff, scratchy polyester uniform, scrubbing grease off the counter of a 24-hour diner during the grueling graveyard shift. The arrogant woman who had once complained about the rising cost of living while drinking expensive wine at my dinner table was now desperately calculating her minimum wage hours just to afford canned soup and bus fare. Her unearned wealth was entirely stripped away, leaving behind a harsh, unforgiving reality. She had finally learned the true agonizing value of a hard-earned dollar, but the lesson had cost her absolutely everything. While Morgan and Bradley faced the utter wreckage of their own making, I returned to the towering glass skyscraper of Apex Vanguard in downtown Chicago. This time, I did not walk in as an unannounced threat. I was greeted as an esteemed partner. I sat at the head of the massive, polished concrete boardroom table alongside Lawrence Park and Sterling Vance. The billionaire chief executive officer personally handed me the finalized legitimate acquisition contracts. There were no hidden cameras, no forged signatures, and no desperate criminals lurking in the shadows. I signed the documents with a steady, victorious hand, legally transferring the title of the historic commercial lot to the tech conglomerate. Within minutes, the banking portal on my encrypted laptop pinged with a secure notification. The $25 million acquisition fund had successfully cleared. However, I did not route a single dime of that massive fortune into my personal pension or use it to purchase luxury estates. That money was forged by Evelyn's hard-working grandfather and protected by my wife's unwavering moral compass. It demanded a far greater purpose than personal comfort. Working closely with Lawrence Park, I legally established a massive philanthropic organization. We officially launched the Evelyn Historic Trust, a heavily funded nonprofit foundation dedicated exclusively to protecting vulnerable senior citizens from financial exploitation and familial abuse. We utilized the $25 million endowment to build an absolute fortress of legal protection for those who could not fight for themselves. We hired a dedicated task force of aggressive, brilliant attorneys, former federal investigators, and specialized forensic auditors. We provided free high-tier legal representation to elderly victims whose own children were attempting to drain their bank accounts, forge their wills, or force them into restrictive state facilities. Whenever a predatory relative attempted to use a fraudulent medical report or a coerced signature to steal a lifetime of savings, our foundation struck back with overwhelming, devastating legal force. We completely leveled the playing field, giving voiceless seniors the exact same tier of ruthless corporate defense that had brought Bradley to his knees. Evelyn always believed that true wealth was measured by how fiercely you protected the defenseless. Now her name was proudly displayed on the glass doors of a legal institution that destroyed predators every single day. Every victory we secured in the courtroom felt like a personal tribute to the woman I loved. I turned the worst betrayal of my entire life into an impenetrable shield for thousands of others. Evelyn's legacy was no longer a secret patch of dirt in Chicago. It was a nationwide beacon of absolute justice. I am sitting on the wooden porch of my quiet suburban home, the crisp morning air carrying the fresh scent of the blooming evergreen hedges. The neighborhood is perfectly still, bathed in the soft golden light of the early sunrise. I hold a steaming mug of black coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands. The house behind me is empty, but it does not feel lonely in the slightest. It feels deeply, incredibly secure. The oppressive, suffocating weight of hidden cameras, deceitful smiles, and malicious whispers has been permanently scrubbed from these walls. I take a slow, deep sip of my coffee, watching a pair of robins land on the edge of Evelyn's rose garden. Over the past few months, I have learned a profound, undeniable truth about the nature of warfare. The loudest, most arrogant person in the room is rarely the most dangerous. True power does not announce itself. True power lies in absolute silence.